Charlie Luciano was rising fast, brushing the crown Al Capone once predicted he'd wear. He wasn't king of booze yet, but he was closing in, attracting attention from New York's underworld titans. Men like Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masseria, Salvatore Maranzano, and Ciro Terranova were feared figures, their names whispered in the Italian ghettos. Beyond their neighborhoods, they were mysteries, known only to corrupt officials who reaped the rewards of their bribes. These old-world bosses had roots in the Sicilian mafia, their power built on tradition, loyalty, and insularity. Their rules were rigid: no outsiders, no tolerance for other ethnicities, and strict adherence to family purity. To Luciano, these traditions were outdated and suffocating. He saw a bigger picture, an America teeming with opportunity, where partnerships could transcend race and background. The black community, the Irish, the Jews, anyone who brought value had a seat at his table. To Luciano and his Americanized peers, Masseria and Maranzano were relics of a bygone era, their power rooted in an outdated system. They were caricatures with their bushy mustaches, ill-fitting suits, and rigid traditions. Yet these relics still ruled, not just in New York but across the country. In Louisiana, Silver Dollar Sam held sway. In Tampa, Santo Trafficante Sr. dominated. And Chicago's legacy was built by Big Jim Colosimo and Johnny Torrio. In New York, Masseria carried the weighty title of Capo di tutti capi, boss of bosses, but to Luciano, the title was meaningless. These old dons lived in shadows, their power confined to their own tight-knit circles. Luciano saw the cracks in their foundations. The era of the old dons was ending, just as Big Jim Colosimo's had in Chicago, making way for the new guard. Luciano was ready to dismantle their world, piece by piece. He knew their time had passed. Respect wouldn't be inherited, it would be seized. And Luciano was prepared to take it all.
When Torrio first knocked off Big Jim Colosimo in Chicago, Frank and I thought that'd help us. We figured it'd be like a sign to them old-fashioned old fat bastards in New York that some of the younger guys was moving up. That's one time we were dead wrong because we forgot how to read our own kind. Masseria, Maranzano, and all the rest of them pricks had been like kings. They ran everything in Little Italy.
By the mid-1920s, Charlie Luciano had become a name that resonated across New York, evoking both fear and admiration. Unlike most gangsters who thrived in shadows, Luciano embraced the limelight, effortlessly navigating between the Italian ghettos and the city's elite circles. While figures like Russell Bufalino and Stefano Magaddino stayed hidden, Luciano wined and dined with celebrities, tycoons, and socialites. His charm won him access to power, but beneath the surface, the wealthy elites viewed him with contempt. A gangster, no matter how polished, would never truly belong. This disdain would later haunt Luciano, who envied men like Meyer Lansky, whose discretion shielded them from scrutiny. In the Roaring Twenties, however, Luciano thrived in the spotlight. Even as he climbed socially, his true focus remained on dismantling the old guard of the underworld. Men like Salvatore Maranzano, relics of the Sicilian mafia's rigid traditions, saw Luciano as a brash upstart. Maranzano had arrived in America after the First World War, bringing Sicilian methods and ambition to dominate the New York underworld. His declaration of war on Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria sparked a brutal feud that bled the city's criminal factions and fueled anti-Italian headlines. Luciano saw opportunity in their chaos. While the two bosses tore into each other, he positioned himself as the silent architect of their downfall. He studied their every move, feeding their rivalry while ensuring it consumed their energy. He remembered every slight, like when a Maranzano lieutenant skimmed profits from a small poker game run by his crew. To Luciano, it was a symbol of the old-timers' arrogance, and he vowed to end their era. The plan was as bold as it was calculated: make them fight, let them bleed each other dry, and seize control when the time was right. Luciano's strategy wasn't just about survival, It was the foundation of his empire, the blueprint for a new order. He wasn't content to merely inherit power. He was determined to build a legacy that would outlast them all.
I always knew, I felt in my bones, that someday this old bastard was going to get in touch with me. But I always knew that no matter what that guy would offer me, I was going to turn it down. When they first came to this country, right after the war, and I was just starting out, that old shit heel would come around the neighborhood once in a while and hold up his hands, spread out like he was the Pope giving the people on the street a blessing.
The first summons came from Salvatore Maranzano, a towering figure in the Italian underworld. Maranzano wasn't just a boss, he was a kingpin, with influence stretching across the olive oil trade, artichokes, cheese distribution, the Italian lottery, and all forms of gambling. His empire was built on tradition, fear, and ruthless precision. For Charlie Luciano, this meeting wasn't just about respect. It was a calculated test. Maranzano saw him as both a rising star and a potential threat. The invitation was more than a courtesy. It was a subtle display of dominance. Luciano, as always, maintained his composure. He understood the silent language of power, knowing when to show deference and when to hold firm. But behind his calm demeanor, his mind worked tirelessly. Men like Maranzano weren't just barriers, they were blueprints. Maranzano's control over Italian markets was the kind of power Luciano coveted, but he envisioned something much greater. Where Maranzano relied on tradition and exclusivity, Luciano dreamed of an empire without borders. He saw alliances that crossed ethnic lines, creating opportunities where others saw enemies. He knew he couldn't challenge Maranzano's strength outright. Not yet. But he could outthink him. Maranzano, like many old-world dons, was rigid and steeped in Sicilian customs. To Luciano, these traditions were weaknesses. The old guard's refusal to adapt made them vulnerable. Luciano wasn't just navigating their world. He was preparing to dismantle it and rebuild it on his terms. This meeting wasn't just a step forward. It was a glimpse of the future he was determined to create.
The meet took place in the back room of a small restaurant that used to be called El Palermo, just off Minetta Street, Little Italy. When I walked in the room, Maranzano comes over to me with his arms up in the air, and there he goes, starting that fucking Pope routine again. He put his arms around me and says that his name is Salvatore like mine, that I'm his namesake, the young Caesar. Then he starts quoting Julius Caesar to me in Latin, for Christ's sake. If he had something nice to say to me, why the hell he couldn't have said it in English? So I told him that. He started to laugh, and I'll never forget what he answered. He said, "My son, words of praise are only meant for the great, and you will do great things." Shit, I could have spit in his face. Then he said to me, "I understand you now like to be called Charlie. Somehow I find it difficult to think of you as anything but Salvatore. Tell me, my name was not good enough for you to keep. There is something about it which shames you." I was just about to answer him and explain how I don't like to be called Sally, but he started to wave his right hand around, and on his pinky finger, where most of them old dons used to wear a diamond that would choke a horse, all Maranzano had was what they call a signet ring with his initials, SM. He held out his hand. I couldn't really tell if he was pleading with me to change my name back, or all he wanted me to do was kiss his lousy ring. It was amazing to me that the old man could not see that I was disgusted with him. He started to go on and on about how he'd been watching the things I was doing, and that he had been very impressed with me, and he thought that I was brave, and I had lots of brains and imagination. And then he threw in a zinger. He tells me he doesn't like the guys I'm associated with.
The old guard of Italian gangsters seethed at Charlie Luciano's boldness. His alliances with the Jewish and Irish communities weren't just unconventional. They were an insult to the rigid traditions of men like Salvatore Maranzano. Steeped in the codes of the Sicilian mafia, Maranzano saw these partnerships as betrayal. Yet, even as disdain lingered, Maranzano wasn't blind to Luciano's potential. The young upstart was a force to be reckoned with, and Maranzano, ever calculating, knew raw talent was too valuable to ignore. Maranzano extended what passed for an olive branch in the cutthroat world of organized crime. an offer of alliance. Framing it as an opportunity, he painted a vision of power and prosperity, promising a united front that could dominate the ever-changing underworld. But Maranzano's idea of partnership was a thinly veiled hierarchy, with Luciano cast firmly beneath him. "You will have an important place," Maranzano assured him, his voice laced with condescension. "I'll make you my second in command. My son." The words struck a nerve. Son. The thought of being patronized, of playing second fiddle in someone else's empire, churned Luciano's stomach. Men like Maranzano offered crumbs while demanding undying loyalty, a deal Charlie would never accept. Calm but resolute, Luciano countered with a faint smile. "That's too bad," he said, his voice steady. "You're talking about friends of mine." Maranzano dismissed the rebuttal with a wave, as though it were a mere bump in the road. "We'll discuss this again," he replied, his tone leaving no room for doubt. But for Luciano, the matter was settled. He wouldn't be anyone's pawn, let alone Maranzano's son. Maranzano's power was undeniable, but his vision was tethered to the past, blind to the broader alliances and opportunities Luciano was quietly building. Declining Maranzano's offer wasn't just a refusal, it was a declaration. Luciano wasn't climbing the ladder of the old guard. He was dismantling it entirely, intent on forging his own path to power. No kingpin, no matter how formidable, was going to stand in his way.
He snaps his finger, and the waiter comes rushing in to open a bottle of red wine and pours out a little bit for the old guy to sample. I can see him smelling the cork and rolling the wine around his mouth to check the flavor and all that crap. Then he waves his signet ring at the waiter, and the guy pours out 2 glasses, and Maranzano says to me, "My dear young man, we will conclude the ceremonies with a toast of our mutual good health, and it's symbolic that the gesture of our friendship and mutual understanding be made with the finest Sicilian wine. Here, Charlie Luciano, I wish you a long life." That was the way he always talked, and it used to drive me nuts. He raised his glass and I raised mine, and I shoveled out the same old long life, good health and all that, and then I drunk the wine. It was absolutely sour. With all his culture and 5 languages, that was one dago you could give piss or vinegar to, and he would drink it as long as it was red and from Sicily. Nothing much, he just don't like Jews. The next day I sent my driver Gino back to Moneta Street with a message, to thank Don Salvatore for his very nice offer, and just to say that this wasn't the right time, and we should sort of leave the door open. Along with the message, I sent a full dozen of quarts of the best 12-year-old King's Ransom Scotch. I knew that he would get it right away that I was saluting the health of the king. That goddamn case of scotch meant over $2,000 to me, but it was worth even more just to show that old prick he wasn't no better than me when it came to doing the right thing.
Luciano had just walked out of his first major sit-down with a true powerhouse in organized crime, a rite of passage that could have unnerved weaker men. But Charlie Luciano wasn't like the others. He didn't falter under Salvatore Maranzano's imposing presence or his calculated offers. He met the moment with steady composure, leaving with his pride and resolve intact. What no one could have known then was that this meeting was more than a business discussion. It was a defining moment in Luciano's rise. For the first time, the old guard, the untouchable titans of the underworld who had dominated for decades, were forced to acknowledge him. They didn't like him or his alliances, and they certainly didn't trust him. But they couldn't ignore him. Luciano was becoming a force, and he knew their tolerance would only last so long. They would either try to absorb him into their ranks or eliminate him entirely. As Luciano stepped into the night, his driver, Gino, buzzed with excitement. "What happened in there, boss?" he asked, eyes alight with curiosity. Charlie, ever calm and deliberate, didn't give much away. Leaning back, he lit a cigarette, exhaled a stream of smoke, and replied coolly, "Just business, Gino. Just business." The words were simple, but their weight was anything but. This wasn't just another deal. It was the start of something bigger, a tectonic shift that would reshape the underworld. For Luciano, It wasn't just about surviving the game. It was about mastering it.
And it was just about this time that the well-known people on the right side of society was getting to know who I was and started to show me some respect. I loved it, and I wasn't going to give that up to go to Maranzano, because I was sure I could make it all the dough I ever wanted on my own.
Charlie Luciano couldn't stand the old-timers and their suffocating rules. Their world was stale, locked in petty blood feuds and rigid Sicilian traditions. The dominant mafia families in New York, ruled by Sicilians, despised outsiders, even fellow Italians like the Neapolitans. Men like Salvatore Maranzano embodied this mindset, favoring loyalists from Castellammare del Golfo and clinging to outdated notions of loyalty. To Luciano, it was narrow-minded and doomed to fail. By his mid-20s, Luciano was already carving out a new path. Unlike the old guard, he formed alliances that crossed ethnic and cultural lines. His closest confidants came from the Jewish underworld: Meyer Lansky, Louis Lecker Buchhalter, Arnold Rothstein, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Men the Sicilian dons despised for their cunning and independence. Luciano also partnered with the Irish through Frank Costello and strengthened ties with Calabrians and Neapolitans like Vito Genovese and Joe Adonis. His vision was revolutionary, embracing inclusivity and the modern world in a way the Sicilians couldn't comprehend. As his power grew, so did his empire. Luciano's influence stretched across the Hudson River into New Jersey, where Joe Adonis developed speakeasies and gambling dens along the Sawdust Trail near Fort Lee. Liquor flowed freely, and with it, the money piled up. Yet, for all his expansion, there was one place Charlie wouldn't touch: Brooklyn. The borough reminded him of his hard upbringing, poverty, street fights, and scars he preferred not to reopen. Luciano's strategy, his willingness to break tradition and embrace the future, reshaped organized crime. While the old-timers clung to their outdated ways, Charlie built an empire that transcended boundaries they couldn't imagine. For him, the future wasn't just an abstract idea. It was a tangible vision he was already bringing to life, one deal at a time.
But not Brooklyn. Never Brooklyn for me personally. That was like a foreign country, and it was okay with me to let it stay there with my good friends Adonis and Scalise to keep me posted on what was going on.
By now, Charlie Luciano wasn't just a rising star in the underworld. He was a powerhouse with allies who mattered and soldiers who delivered. Men like Abner Longhi Swillman and Willie Moretti fortified the Bug and Meyer gang, while enforcers like Albert Anastasia, Dutch Schultz, and Louis Lepke Buchhalter executed violence with precision. Luciano's operation wasn't just expanding, it was evolving into a smooth, efficient empire. Luciano's reputation was built on quality. His liquor wasn't just plentiful, it was the best. Manhattan's speakeasies served it to the city's elite, who sought not only his product but his company. Luciano seamlessly climbed the social ladder, becoming a regular at Manhattan's top nightclubs. He rubbed shoulders with celebrities, socialites and power brokers, presenting himself not as a criminal, but as a man of charm and influence. Beyond New York, Luciano extended his reach. He played golf in Miami with Jimmy Blue Eyes, Arlo, and fished with Chicago powerhouses like Tony Accardo and Paul Ricca. For Luciano, these moments weren't just leisure. They were opportunities to solidify trust and forge alliances. Business and pleasure blended seamlessly as Luciano expanded his network. By the early 1930s, Luciano's ambitions reached Wall Street, where his mafia empire intersected with corporate vulnerabilities. The Great Depression left industries desperate for cash, and the mafia stepped in as a shadow banking cartel. With fortunes amassed from bootlegging, Luciano and his associates, men like Vito Genovese and Santo Trafficante Sr., funneled money into struggling businesses. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving, evolving into economic power players. While narcotics hadn't yet entered the picture, the foundation was being laid for an empire that would dominate gambling, Hollywood, and entertainment. The mafia wasn't just America's underworld anymore. It was becoming its silent financier, shaping industries from the shadows. By the time Luciano was deported, his blueprint for the mafia as an economic powerhouse was already transforming America's landscape.
One of my big-shot customers was a guy in that Whitney family, the stockbrokers. He was a polo player, and he invited me out to his tremendous estate he had in Manhasset, Long Island, to watch him play polo and to supply the party he was giving afterwards. All of them society girls gathered and asked me how we hijacked shipments and how sometimes we would shoot it out with feds and stuff like that. They listened to me with their eyes wide open like I was some kind of movie star, like Douglas Fairbanks. I piled it on and they loved it.
Charlie Luciano had become a man of stature, moving through New York with the confidence of someone who ruled its streets. Rarely alone, he was often seen with a stunning dancer on his arm, her beauty complementing his impeccably tailored suits. Companionship was never an issue. Joe Adonis, who ran the glamorous Copacabana, ensured Luciano's options were endless. The Copacabana was the heart of New York nightlife, a playground where gangsters and glitterati mingled, and it was a world where Charlie thrived. Polished, charming, and dressed to perfection, he seamlessly navigated the spaces between the elite and the underworld. Luciano's refinement was a legacy of Arnold Rothstein, who taught him the value of charm and respectability. But beneath the surface, Luciano remained a gangster, a man who carried a gun and ruled his empire with ruthless precision. Arrests were mere inconveniences, quickly smoothed over by bribes and influence. The liquor trade and rackets that built his fortune were far from peaceful, but Luciano and his crew kept control with an iron grip. With success came indulgence, and Luciano lived like a king. A fixture at wild parties, he often left with beautiful women on his arm, feeding whispers in high society. Rumors swirled about his relationships, with some claiming he struggled to keep up with the women in his life. Eventually, Luciano addressed the gossip head-on. After being cleared of an STD that had plagued him for years, he admitted the ordeal left lasting scars, physical and psychological. "It just wasn't worth it," he confessed, his confidence intact despite the personal revelation. Such whispers, however, were overshadowed by his growing empire and reputation. His name inspired both fear and admiration, and questions arose about his darker deeds. Had he killed? Ordered hits? The answers were unspoken but obvious. Yes. Blood had always been a part of his story. When pressed, Luciano would smirk and reply, "There's nothing I've done that any other businessman wouldn't do to protect what's his." It was a chilling statement, delivered with charm, leaving no doubt about who he truly was. Charlie Luciano wasn't just a king. He was an untouchable force in a world ruled by ruthlessness.
Did I kill anybody myself? That depends how you look at it. If it means did I ever pull the trigger and knock somebody off myself, then the answer is no. Nobody ever died from my gun. I managed to hurt a few people bad, but no murder. On the other hand, if you look at it from the strict letter of the law, where an accessory or a guy who gives the orders to make a hit is just as guilty as the guy who pulls the trigger, then I guess I'd done my fair share.
Charlie Luciano's response about protecting what's his wasn't just a clever deflection. It was a gross understatement. The truth was far darker. Luciano wasn't merely a participant in organized crime. He was its architect, the mastermind behind one of history's most fearsome criminal syndicates. If his hands weren't on the trigger, his influence ensured countless lives ended. His creation, Murder Incorporated, was the ultimate testament to his ruthlessness, a shadowy execution squad that enforced his will with blood and terror. Murder Incorporated was no ordinary gang. Its members were professional killers, men who didn't see murder as a necessity, but as a way of life. Operating without mercy, they carried out executions across the country, leaving trails of blood from New York to Chicago, Louisiana, and beyond. These weren't just gangsters. They were sociopaths, cloaked in suits, men who turned killing into an art form. For Luciano, it wasn't about sadism. It was about control. Fear and death were tools he wielded with precision, the cornerstones of an empire built on intimidation. Luciano's ambition reached beyond syndicates and into the unthinkable, control of law enforcement. By the 1960s, his successors had corrupted large swathes of the New York Police Department, transforming entire precincts into mob assets. But this level of infiltration didn't happen overnight. It began in Luciano's era. As early as 1925, he targeted precincts, buying officers, judges, and officials to ensure his operations ran smoothly. Arrests became mere formalities, with charges dismissed before they could pose a threat. To the public, Luciano appeared untouchable, a polished businessman who exuded charm and confidence. In truth, his empire thrived on fear, corruption, and cold-blooded violence. By the time the FBI finally turned its focus on organized crime decades later, Luciano's vision had already taken root. The mafia wasn't just a criminal network, it was a shadow government, meticulously built by Luciano, brick by bloody brick.
When the fix was in, it was a breeze. Nothing to it. After all, that's what Costello and the buy bank back was making sure of. Most of the time, if I ever got picked up, it was because some precinct captain wanted to talk to me private about a raise in pay.
In his later years, Charlie Luciano often looked back on his life with a mix of pride and regret. Among the memories that lingered most vividly was one bittersweet Christmas dinner, a moment that stayed with him like a shadow. The dinner, meant to be a celebration, became a poignant reflection of his family's struggle to reconcile their old-world roots with the new life he had built. Luciano's mother, a proud Sicilian matriarch, wanted desperately to connect with the son whose world had grown so far from her own. Determined to show her love in a way she thought he would understand, she abandoned the comfort of traditional Sicilian dishes and painstakingly prepared an American feast. Roast turkey, stuffing, and cranberry sauce replaced the familiar aromas of pasta and rich sauces, a gesture of assimilation that she hoped would bridge the gap between them. As the family gathered around the table, Luciano recalled the forced smiles and the weight of unspoken emotions. The turkey was dry, the flavors unfamiliar, and the atmosphere heavy with a sense of disconnection. His mother's effort, though heartfelt, seemed to amplify the distance between their worlds. It wasn't about the food, Luciano later realized. It was about what the meal represented, the struggle between heritage and assimilation, between the life his family had left behind and the one he was forging. For Charlie, the memory grew more poignant over time. His mother's attempt to make him feel at home was her way of showing she understood, even if she couldn't fully grasp the man he had become. She wanted to make me feel at home in a place we didn't belong, Luciano reflected years later. But all it did was remind me how far away home really was. The dinner became a symbol of the quiet sacrifices his family had made, and their enduring efforts to hold on to him, even as he slipped further into a world they could never truly understand. It was a memory that encapsulated both the love and the distance that defined their lives.
I met Willie that afternoon in a diner on the outskirts of Jersey City. My car was loaded with presents for my whole family, and I promised my mother I'd be there for turkey dinner about 4 o'clock. She was making it special for me. She wanted to prove she could cook American. If I disappointed her, I knew my old man would murder me.
Christmas Day was meant to be for family, but for Charlie Luciano, the demands of organized crime always came first. While his mother labored over an elaborate meal to impress him, Charlie was out ensuring a deal went smoothly. Trouble wasn't on his agenda, but trouble always had a way of finding him. On his way to the meeting, 2 police officers stopped him. Acting on a tip, they searched Luciano and found a gun, a leftover from a job the night before. He was promptly hauled off to the state police headquarters in Newark. In a dim back room at the station, Luciano's fortunes took an unexpected turn. Behind the desk stood a high-ranking officer in a polished uniform, a general no less, who greeted Willie Moretti with a handshake and a warm smile. Moretti, as it turned out, had the man on his payroll. Watching the interaction, Charlie felt a wave of relief. His luck seemed to be holding. One of the officers leaned into the room, sheepishly apologizing to Moretti for the arrest. "I'm deeply sorry for this, Mr. Moretti," the officer said, "but I've got to book you for being with a guy carrying a gun." Moretti, unfazed, waved it off with a grin. "That's okay," he replied calmly. For Charlie, it felt like the storm had passed. He even laughed, saying, "Boy, am I glad you're a friend of Moretti's." But the officer's expression hardened. Leaning closer, his voice turned sharp. "Yes, I am," he said, "but I'm not a friend of yours." In that moment, Charlie's relief evaporated. He realized the precariousness of his position. Moretti's influence couldn't shield him entirely. To escape, Luciano did what he always did: paid his way out. The fix cost him a staggering $10,000, a painful sum even for him. When Charlie returned home, the celebration was over. The atmosphere was cold, tense. His siblings avoided his gaze, and his father's disappointment filled the room. Luciano could feel the weight of his family's disapproval, hear the unspoken rebukes. His father, no doubt, would chastise his mother for holding out hope for him. For Charlie, there was no time to dwell on it. The cost of his life wasn't just financial, it was personal, a relentless toll that demanded more with every passing day.
Nobody says a word. They're all looking at my father, and he's looking at this big turkey that's sitting in the middle of the table, all cold and shriveled up like it's been out in the snow. I'm standing there with an armful of Christmas presents, so I drop them on the floor and I say, "There are for everybody." And I hand my brother Bart an envelope with money in it and tell him, "Give this to Pop when he isn't so mad." And I turn around and walk out. My father didn't talk to me for another 6 months.
Charlie Luciano was now inseparable from the underworld. No matter the occasion, Christmas, birthdays, or weddings, business always came first. Ambition demanded sacrifices, and though Luciano embraced them in his prime, those choices would haunt him in his twilight years. Sitting alone in exile in Italy, far from the empire he built, he would reflect on the cracks his hunger for power had created in his personal life. His insatiable drive for wealth and dominance blinded him to the damage he was inflicting on those closest to him. Every decision seemed like a step toward greater success, but each one came with risks, and those risks often spiraled into mistakes that carried steep consequences. Luciano's life had become a high-stakes balancing act, teetering on the edge of disaster as he sought to dominate every racket, outmaneuver rivals, and solidify his control. Yet in his relentless pursuit of power, he overlooked the toll it took on the trust and faith of his family, the people who had once believed in him. To them, the boy they knew had been consumed by the man he became. For Luciano, however, the pull of the underworld was irresistible. It wasn't just his calling. It was his identity. The choices he made weren't just part of his life. They were who he was, and there was no escaping the shadow he had cast.
I did something I never done before or afterwards. I got money hungry, like I wasn't already making a fortune, most of it from booze, but a lot of it from gambling and the jobs our boys would pull a couple of times a week that would leave us with a pile of jewelry and furs. Then I got greedy, and I walked right into my own trap like a goddamn fool.
In June 1923, Charlie Luciano made a mistake that would haunt him for years. It began with an introduction from Vito Genovese, a trusted ally with a knack for persuasion. Genovese brought Luciano into the orbit of Charlie Lagaipa, known as Big Nose Charlie, a heroin dealer notorious for sampling his own supply. The pitch was irresistible. Invest $20,000, and the heroin would net $100,000 on the streets. To sweeten the deal, Vito offered Luciano 60% of the profits if he fronted the cash. The product was ready to move, and the plan seemed airtight. Despite initial hesitation, Luciano agreed, a rare lapse in judgment for a man with such sharp instincts. On June 5, 1923, Luciano was arrested on 14th Street. Several packages of pure heroin stuffed in his pocket. The weight of his mistake hit immediately. "I must have been crazy, like a loose nut, to take Vito up on his offer," he later admitted. He could have sent anyone from his crew to handle the deal, but he chose to oversee it personally. Worse, he processed the heroin himself at one of Joe Adonis's properties, taking an unnecessary and fatal risk. Once arrested, Luciano quickly learned the limits of his influence. His usual police contacts were useless, and even Frank Costello's political connections couldn't help. Narcotics agents were relentless, incorruptible, and immune to bribes. For the first time, Luciano was cornered. Desperation led him to break the mafia's sacred code of omertà. Cooperation was his only escape, a decision that would stain his reputation for years to come. The fallout was devastating. Luciano's anger at himself burned brighter than the shame of the arrest. He had broken the very code he demanded from others, all for a quick profit that turned into disaster. It was a critical misstep, a blemish on his otherwise unstoppable rise. The lesson was harsh but clear. Never gamble with your freedom, and trust no one completely, not even your closest allies.
With one junk conviction on my record, and with everybody knowing my puss, it looked like I was going up for a long stay in the federal pen. I tried everything. I offered them 3 bastards anything they could name, but they wouldn't even look at me. For the first time, I really had things going good, and now on my own greed was going to chop my legs off.
The year 1923 was a turning point for Charlie Luciano, a moment when his ambition crossed into a world he would come to regret. His arrest on heroin charges left a stain on his reputation, sparking accusations that would haunt him for years. Whispers began circulating that Luciano wasn't just a bootlegging mastermind, but also a significant player in the narcotics trade. However, the truth was more complex. After his arrest, Luciano made a pivotal decision. He would never touch narcotics again. The incident had been a costly mistake, one that damaged him financially, reputationally, and strategically. It opened his eyes to the brutal world of drug trafficking, where players like the French Corsican mafia operated by an unforgiving code. Luciano described them as cannibals, men who wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who broke their rules. In their world, loyalty and silence were non-negotiable, and Luciano's cooperation with authorities during his arrest made him a marked man. To the Corsicans and other traffickers, Luciano was a liability. A trafficker who couldn't take a prison sentence without spilling secrets wasn't just untrustworthy. He was expendable. If Luciano had stayed in the narcotics business, his partners would have undoubtedly turned on him. The arrest didn't just tarnish his image in the drug world. It severed his ties to it permanently. For Luciano, stepping away from narcotics wasn't just about survival. It was a chance to refocus. He poured his energy into bootlegging, gambling, and other rackets, where the risks, though high, didn't carry the same mortal stakes. While the arrest had momentarily shaken his reputation, it ultimately allowed him to recalibrate and rebuild. Steering clear of the dangerous world of drugs, Luciano began laying the foundation for an empire on his own terms, one that wouldn't rely on an industry destined to devour its own.
If I couldn't buy them guys, maybe I could hand them something that would help me make a deal. When we got to the station, they let me make a telephone call. I didn't call my lawyer. I called my brother Bart, and I talked to him in Sicilian. I told him that I wanted him to do an errand exactly like I explained, with no changes. I told him to go to a certain place in Little Italy and move a box like a small trunk, made out of cardboard, from one place to another, and he wasn't to look inside.
In the dimly lit basement of the precinct, Charlie Luciano faced a relentless barrage of questions from local and federal agents, their frustration and menace palpable. Yet Luciano stayed calm. He had learned from mentors like Arnold Rothstein that composure was a weapon, especially in moments of crisis. As the hours dragged on, a plan began to form. By now he trusted Bart, one of his loyal men, to have handled the necessary groundwork. It was time to make his move. Charlie wouldn't name names. Crossing that line was unthinkable. But he offered an alternative, a tip that would lead the agents to a bigger score. He directed them to 164 Mulberry Street, instructing them to search the basement and check the closet. When the agents arrived, they found exactly what he had promised, a significant stash of heroin. The bust was enough to satisfy them, and the charges against Luciano disappeared. He walked out of the precinct a free man, but the victory came at a cost. The ordeal wiped out his $20,000 investment, and Charlie Lagaipa, his contact, lost everything. The experience was a sobering one. Luciano had ventured into a world he couldn't fully control and barely escaped with his freedom. It was a mistake he wouldn't repeat. From that day on, Luciano swore off narcotics, recognizing that the risks far outweighed the rewards. Narcotics agents were incorruptible, relentless, and immune to the tactics that had kept him untouchable elsewhere. This near disaster reshaped Luciano's strategy, steering him away from drugs and back toward rackets where his power was absolute. The incident was a hard-earned lesson in survival, a stark reminder that even someone as cunning and resourceful as Charlie Luciano wasn't invincible. It was a mistake he would never forget, and one that would define the boundaries of his empire for years to come.
I give a good bundle to Big Nose Lagaipa because I blew his profits for him. What I found out later was that the guys only turned in half the haul, which means that the other half got back on the street, and somebody not only got credit for pulling in Charlie Luciano, but probably wound up with 50 grand for half the stuff I already paid for.
The year was 1923, and Charlie Luciano had built a reputation as a discreet and dependable provider of vice for New York's elite. To the upper crust, he wasn't a gangster. He was a businessman supplying liquor, gambling, and entertainment in a city suffocating under prohibition. Luciano understood the stakes. His clean image among these influential patrons was his shield, their protection invaluable. But in the underworld, lines were never so clear. While Luciano avoided narcotics, men in his orbit, particularly Vito Genovese, were testing the waters. Genovese, ambitious and ruthless, saw heroin as a golden opportunity, not just for profit, but for power. This foresight would later define the mafia's future. By the 1930s, Genovese established connections in Italy, creating heroin pipelines that would dominate the drug trade by the 1950s. The Second World War further shaped this landscape, as soldiers returning from battlefields, hardened and disillusioned, slipped into mafia ranks, fueling the Italian family's dominance over organized crime. By the 1950s, the mafia controlled the heroin trade, their grip unshaken even as new players emerged, including black organized crime groups that rose in the 1960s, with heroin flowing from Southeast Asia. But for Luciano, the seeds of this future empire had nothing to do with him, or so he claimed. Luciano's arrest on heroin charges in 1923 shattered his carefully curated image. Headlines smeared the reputation he had meticulously built, and whispers within his ranks suggested he had been involved in narcotics all along. Although the charges derailed his standing temporarily, Luciano swore off drugs, recognizing their potential to destroy his empire. Still, the damage was done. Even years later, when exiled to Italy, rumors persisted that Luciano sought to control the global narcotics trade from its European source. Yet, Charlie Luciano was nothing if not resilient. He knew that power wasn't static. It was rebuilt, brick by brick, calculated move by calculated move. His legacy as the boss of bosses was forever tainted by the heroin mistake, but he understood the art of reinvention. Respect wasn't given, it was earned. And for Luciano, the climb was far from over.
But the worst thing was that I got tabbed from them on as a guy who handled narcotics. And because it was me, I was called the big guy in the junk business. No matter what I tried to do, I could never lose that rep of being a junk dealer.
The accusation of being a narcotics trafficker clung to Charlie Luciano like a scarlet letter, haunting him for the rest of his life. No matter how far he distanced himself from the heroin trade, the stain of his 1923 arrest refused to fade. It didn't matter that the French Corsican mafia was already establishing Europe's narcotics pipeline, or that Vito Genovese wouldn't build the mafia's heroin empire in Italy until the 1930s. Nor did anyone care that, in his mid-20s, Luciano was too consumed with managing the chaos of bootlegging to mastermind a nationwide drug operation. The narrative stuck, and it tainted everything he built. By 1925, at just 28, Luciano's empire was thriving, but it was still in its formative stages. Bootlegging alone demanded his full attention, with its constant rivalries and the threat of violence from ambitious competitors. Drugs were a complication he didn't need, and after 1923 he made a firm decision. He would never touch narcotics again. Instead, he focused on safer ventures: gambling, unions, political corruption, and other rackets that would eventually solidify his power. Yet the rumors didn't die. The 1923 arrest fueled whispers that Luciano had been secretly involved in drugs all along. His narrow escape, where heroin destined for Joe Adonis's hideouts was seized, only amplified the suspicions. Some of his men began to believe he was operating discreetly, keeping his drug dealings under wraps while maintaining plausible deniability. What Luciano saw as a costly mistake, others viewed as calculated genius. The incident forced Luciano to confront his vulnerabilities. For a man who prided himself on control, the arrest was a harsh reminder of how quickly law enforcement could exploit a single misstep. Federal agents, eager to make their careers, wouldn't hesitate to use his mistakes to take him down. For the first time, Luciano felt the weight of his own fallibility, a bitter realization for someone who had always navigated the game with unshakable confidence. To his associates, however, the arrest and release were proof of Luciano's brilliance. They celebrated his defiance, praising his ability to outsmart the system without naming names. To them, his triumph was a blueprint for survival, a sign of his genius. But for Charlie, it wasn't a win. It was a blemish that threatened his carefully cultivated image. He didn't want to be known as a drug dealer, a label that could destroy the credibility he'd worked so hard to build among high society and influential allies. Luciano's shame over the ordeal ran deep. He had gambled everything for a quick deal he didn't need, letting greed cloud his judgment. It was a mistake he couldn't afford to repeat. As always, Luciano would rebuild and bounce back, but the experience left a lasting mark. It was a stark reminder of the delicate balance he had to maintain in a world where one wrong move could topple everything he had worked so hard to achieve.
I was really ashamed to face all my friends I made in society, guys I played golf with. All I could think about was how to get clean again in front of them legit people. Besides, for the whole summer I was being grilled every 5 minutes by the police, or else I had to go and see the psychiatrist every day for 2 hours, which was one of the conditions they made when they dropped the charges. I didn't want to go out and to make any deliveries up on Park Avenue. I wouldn't even go to the Speaks unless it was some joint that didn't have the better class of customers. I was like a hermit. Then one day I get a telephone call from a Wall Street guy, Julie Bache. I not only supplied him but practically all his customers, and I knew he liked me.
Bache had one question for Charlie Luciano, and it cut straight to the point. Had he really been involved in narcotics? Keeping his composure, Charlie admitted to the mistake. "I was stupid enough to make one deal," he said, his voice tinged with regret, but steady enough to be convincing. To his relief, Bache believed him. Before leaving, Bache extended an olive branch, suggesting Charlie visit him sometime. It was a small gesture, but for Luciano it felt monumental, a glimmer of hope that all wasn't lost. If Baccia could be convinced, perhaps others could too. But Luciano knew that words alone wouldn't erase the stain of his arrest. He needed a strategy to shift the narrative, to rebuild his reputation. Fortunately, the underworld had already mastered the art of influence, a precursor to what we now call sports washing. Just as today's elites use lavish events to mask controversies, the mafia wielded entertainment and access to high-demand events as tools of persuasion. Luciano's men were well versed in this tactic. Tickets to exclusive events, boxing matches, concerts, or Broadway shows became currency among politicians, judges, and business elites. Bribes weren't always envelopes of cash. They could be ringside seats, backstage passes, or invitations to the year's biggest spectacle. These favors, technically illegal but nearly impossible to trace, worked wonders for mending reputations and securing alliances. As Luciano mulled over his next move, Joe Adonis called. "Come to the Follies tonight," Adonis insisted, promising a night of fun and girls to distract him from his troubles. Before Charlie could respond, another visitor arrived, Meyer Lansky. Lansky had a different plan. He invited Charlie for a good Jewish dinner, a request that made Luciano laugh. "What's the catch?" Charlie asked, knowing Lansky always had an angle. Lansky didn't disappoint. He leaned in with a sly smile and presented a plan he called the Lansky Law. The idea was simple, but brilliant. Find what people crave and make it indispensable. Lansky suggested that Charlie acquire something in high demand and use it to regain influence. This wasn't just about redemption, it was about power, about reminding the right people that they needed Luciano as much as he needed them. Charlie listened intently, already considering the possibilities. Lansky's plan wasn't just a way to recover from scandal. It was a roadmap for turning the situation to his advantage. Power wasn't about brute force alone. It was about influence, access, and making people feel indebted. For Luciano, it was perfect. If Lansky's strategy worked, Charlie wouldn't just clean his image. He'd turn the scandal into another step on his relentless ascent to the top of organized crime.
Right now, you want to impress a lot of people. Don't you know that this whole town is made up with nothing but whores? Give them something they want bad enough and they'll even buy horse shit and molasses.
Charlie Luciano initially misinterpreted Meyer Lansky's plan, thinking it involved giving away his finest liquor as a goodwill gesture. But Lansky, ever the strategist, had something far more ambitious in mind. He leaned in, his tone calm, but charged with excitement, and laid out the idea: the fight. On September 14, 1923, one of the most anticipated events in sports history was set to take place at the Polo Grounds. 82,000 fans would gather to watch heavyweight champion Jack Dempsey face Luis Angel Firpo, the wild bull of the Pampas. Dempsey was at the height of his fame, and boxing was America's premier spectacle. This wasn't just a sporting event, it was a social phenomenon, a place where the elite came to see and be seen. Lansky understood the stakes. In the 1920s, boxing was more than entertainment. It was a cultural cornerstone. Politicians, power brokers, and social climbers all clamored for a seat, not just to witness the fight, but to cement their status. Even J. Edgar Hoover was known to attend mob-controlled boxing matches, mingling with the very people he publicly condemned. To miss an event of this magnitude was to risk social obscurity. Tickets, therefore, were worth their weight in gold. Lansky's plan was brilliant. Monopolize the tickets. If Luciano's crew could control access to the best seats, they could dictate who attended, and more importantly, who sat next to whom. It wasn't just about selling tickets, it was about cultivating influence. Imagine a desperate industrialist landing a prime seat, only to find himself sitting beside one of Luciano's well-dressed associates. The message was clear. Access came through Charlie Luciano. Luciano immediately grasped the genius of the plan. This wasn't just a fight, it was an opportunity to network, forge alliances, and solidify his position among the powerful and ambitious. In an era when news traveled slowly, and Luciano's name wasn't yet infamous outside New York, this was a chance to introduce himself as more than a gangster. He could present himself as a benefactor, a man who could make things happen. On the night of the fight, Luciano's influence was undeniable. Over 200 attendees sat in prime seats as his personal guests, scattered strategically throughout the stadium. Charlie himself became part of the spectacle, his presence a draw almost as compelling as Dempsey and Firpo in the ring. For the elites in attendance, Luciano was no longer just a name. They owed their night to him. For Luciano, it was a masterstroke in power and perception. He turned a single event into a platform to rebuild his tarnished reputation, proving that in the right hands, influence wasn't just about fear. It was about access and opportunity. That night, Charlie Luciano wasn't just a gangster. He became a power broker.
I got a telephone call from Philly, right when I was talking to Meyer, from a guy by the name of Ben Gimbel. His old man was one of the founders of that big department store outfit, and Ben was about as old as me, and that was pretty good playboy. He used to come up to New York from Philly every other night. He had a lot of girls in the shows and we got to know each other. He was calling to find out if I could get him 2 tickets to the Dempsey-Firpo fight, on account of he and his family was pretty good customers of ours, and Waxy's down in Philly. But he first started that poo-poo in the newspaper crap about drugs, and he wanted to make sure I didn't take it too bad. I kind of liked the idea that guy from such a well-known family didn't mind calling me after everything that was said. In fact, later on, I gave him the tickets for free.
Charlie Luciano had a problem. He needed 198 more tickets to secure seats for his guests at the Dempsey-Firpo fight. This wasn't just about attending a boxing match. It was about cementing his influence, forging alliances, and proving to the elites that he was still a man of power and opportunity. Without those tickets, his plan to reclaim his reputation was at risk. There was only one place he could turn to: the Follies. The Follies, New York's most glamorous revue show, was more than a hotspot for entertainment. It was where business deals and backroom negotiations blurred seamlessly. Joe Adonis, ever the connector, held court there regularly, surrounded by showgirls and power players. When Luciano entered that night, Adonis greeted him with his signature charm, immediately reading the situation. "You're here for tickets, aren't you?" he asked with a sly grin, already knowing why Charlie had come. Luciano wasted no time explaining his plan to host over 200 guests at the fight. Adonis listened, then leaned in with a proposition. "Leave it to me," he said. "I'll get you those tickets. But you're going to owe me one, Charlie." Luciano didn't hesitate. A favor owed to Adonis wasn't small, but failure wasn't an option. This fight was more than a spectacle. It was a chance to re-establish himself as a force to be reckoned with. By the end of the night, Adonis had promised the tickets, leveraging his deep connections with theater owners and scalpers to make it happen. When September 14th arrived, the Polo Grounds were packed with over 80,000 fans. Among them, more than 200 were Luciano's guests, seated in prime spots. Each one knew that their access came courtesy of Charlie Luciano, a man who could make things happen. For Luciano, it was a gamble that paid off. The fight wasn't just about boxing, it was about power, perception, and control. That night, Luciano didn't just reclaim his standing, he reinforced it. In the eyes of New York's elite, Charlie wasn't just back in the game, he was running it.
That night after the Follies, who do I run into at Dave's Blue Room but Bill Coram, the famous sports writer? I said, "Bill, I need some tickets for the Dempsey-Firpo fight." He says to me with a laugh, "Would you like mine?" Of course, he was only kidding, but I took him up on it and I said, "As a matter of fact, I would. And all the rest of them in your row." When he realized I was serious, he says, Jesus Christ, Charlie, you want me to get 20 tough newspaper guys to give up their front row seats? Where the hell do you expect them to sit? And I said to him, in the row behind me, the second row. But that ain't all, pals. I want another 90 seats in the first 5 rows. Do you think you can handle it? I don't give a shit what it costs, Bill. I gotta have all of them seats. I don't know how Bill done it, but 2 days later I had all the tickets I asked for and where I wanted them. It cost me about 25 grand and I never regretted it.
While Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and Joe Adonis scrambled to secure the remaining tickets, Charlie Luciano was already positioning himself as the man everyone wanted to know. By the time the tickets were in his hands, Charlie was at the center of a storm of attention. His phone rang incessantly. Everyone wanted a piece of the spectacle at the polo grounds. But for Luciano, the tickets weren't just a commodity. They were a weapon of influence. To capitalize on the moment, Luciano and his inner circle crafted a meticulous plan. A list of 600 names was drawn up, each representing someone who could help strengthen Luciano's empire. The recipients were carefully selected: suppliers to ensure smooth operations, politicians to turn a blind eye, police officers to keep their distance, and key figures across society who could prove useful in the future. Each recipient received 2 tickets, one for themselves and one for a guest of equal importance. The math was simple but powerful. 200 tickets, each one a personal favor, each one a thread tying Luciano's influence deeper into the fabric of power. It wasn't just bribery. It was the creation of a network of obligations. Every recipient would remember who had given them access to the fight of the decade, and every handshake that night would ripple with potential. When fight night arrived, the polo grounds buzzed with over 80,000 fans, and among them, Luciano's influence was everywhere. 200 of his personal guests sat in prime seats, mingling with high society, politicians, and power players. The boxing ring was more than a stage for Jack Dempsey and Luis Angel Firpo. It was a stage for Luciano's ambitions. That night, Charlie Luciano solidified himself not just as a kingpin, but as a master strategist, someone who could turn a fight into a platform for power. It was a masterclass in influence, a display of how to wield opportunity with precision. By the end of the night, Luciano had done more than rehabilitate his reputation. He had elevated himself into a figure no corner of society could ignore. In a single event, he turned bad press into a legacy, proving once again that he didn't just play the game, he mastered it.
What a job that was to cut that list down to 100 pairs, including ourselves. There was a lot of guys who was pretty sore being left off, but we had to do it the best.
Charlie Luciano knew that appearances mattered more than most people realized. A man's suit wasn't just clothing. It was armor, a statement of who he was and how he wanted the world to see him. With the fight fast approaching and his influence at an all-time high, Charlie needed something special. Something that screamed respectability, authority, and unshakable confidence. For this, there was only one man he trusted, the one who had taught him how to use clothes as a weapon of perception. Luciano went straight to Arnold Rothstein's tailor, the man who had outfitted some of the most powerful figures in New York. Rothstein himself had once explained to Charlie that a well-tailored suit could open doors no bribe ever could. It wasn't just about the cut of the fabric, it was about the message it sent. The right suit could make even the roughest gangster look like a gentleman who belonged in the highest circles.
So I got hold of Arnold Rothstein, and the next morning he picked me up and took me down to John Wanamaker's department store. Actually, I felt a little guilty, and I told Arnold that maybe I owed it to Ben Gimbel to go to his old man's store, but he said to me, "No, Charlie, John Wanamaker's men's department has the stuff you need. I'm going to turn you into another Francis X. Bushman. I want you to wear something conservative and elegant made by a Gentile tailor." Arnold gave me a dozen French ties made by some guy by the name of Chauvet. They were supposed to be the best, and Arnold brought 100 ties whenever he went to Paris. He also used to buy the silk for his shirts by the bolt at a place in France called Sulca, and he always would give me some as a present. That's how I get the rep for wearing silk shirts and underwear and pajamas.
Charlie Luciano was ready to step back into the spotlight. With the fight at the Polo Grounds fast approaching, he had everything he needed to make his first major public appearance since the arrest that had momentarily tarnished his reputation. He had secured enough tickets to make himself the most in-demand man in New York, and now, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that radiated respectability and authority, he was prepared to reclaim his place among the city's elite. The Jack Dempsey-Luis Angel Firpo fight on September 14, 1923, was the social event of the year. The air around the Polo Grounds buzzed with excitement as more than 80,000 fans poured in, eager to witness the heavyweight champion defend his title. It wasn't just a sporting event, it was a spectacle, a place to see and be seen, where society's most powerful figures mingled under the glare of the lights.
So, the night of the fight, I had a beautiful double-breasted dark Oxford gray suit, a plain white shirt, a dark blue silk tie with little tiny horseshoes on it, which was Arnold's sense of humor. I had a charcoal gray herringbone cashmere topcoat, because it was a little cool, with a Kavanaugh gray fedora, very plain. Rothstein gave me a whole new image, and it had a lot of influence on me. After that, I'd always wore gray suits and coats, and once in a while I'd throw on a blue serge.
At the Dempsey-Firpo fight, Meyer Lansky's vision became reality. The night transcended boxing, becoming a display of power and influence. At just 26 years old, Charlie Luciano orchestrated a gathering that united some of the most powerful figures in New York and beyond. Politicians, police commissioners, crime bosses, and legitimate businessmen mingled under the dazzling lights of the Polo Grounds, their gratitude directed toward the man who had made it all possible. For many, the event marked a turning point in their perception of Luciano. Those inclined to believe in his innocence forgave him entirely, seeing him as a victim of bad luck, unfairly tarnished by one mistake. Others, less concerned with morality, ignored his past altogether. They recognized his value, a young man whose connections and cunning could open doors and advance their ambitions. In a world where power and loyalty trumped virtue, Luciano was proving himself indispensable. The audacity of what he had accomplished couldn't be overstated. Born in 1897 to a poor Sicilian family, Luciano had arrived in America unable to speak English. By 26, he had not only built a criminal empire, but also assembled a gathering that blurred the lines between the underworld and high society. The Polo Grounds became a meeting place where crime bosses mingled with crooked politicians and influential businessmen. This wasn't an official commission meeting, but it might as well have been. At the center of it all was Charlie Luciano, a rising power, commanding respect across all spheres. What made the night even more extraordinary was that it had been born out of a mistake. Luciano had turned a near disaster into an opportunity to elevate himself. His ability to transform misfortune into triumph set him apart, showcasing the resourcefulness and vision that others lacked. For Charlie, the night was intoxicating. The attention, the fame, the gratitude. It all fed a growing hunger within him. He had tasted true power, the kind that made him an equal among America's elite, and he wanted more. At 26, Luciano was already a king in the making, his fortune built on vice and violence. He had killed, consolidated power, and now found himself rubbing shoulders with the country's wealthiest and most influential figures. The lights of the Polo Grounds illuminated more than just the fight. They cast Charlie Luciano in a new glow, transforming him into an A-list celebrity of his time. The boy who once roamed Manhattan streets, learning English in the gutters and clawing his way up with fists and cunning, was now a man who commanded a room with his mere presence. For Luciano, there was no turning back. The power, The influence, the intoxicating pull of being at the top. It wasn't just a goal anymore. It was his identity. Charlie Luciano wasn't just a gangster. He was becoming a force of nature.
For the first time in my life, I had a feeling of real power. It's what I always had dreamed about, that someday the biggest people in New York would come up to me to say hello, to say thanks, for the ringside seats that their big-shot friends couldn't get for love or money. It was a pretty big thing when Dick Enright, the police commissioner of the whole city, came over to see how I was feeling. And right with him was Bill Leahy, his police chief. Why not? They were on our payroll. There were an awful lot of people on our list: Jimmy Hines and Al Marinelli from Tammany Hall. There was an up-and-coming politician from Brooklyn who was going to be a big guy with our help, Kenny Sutherland, later Democratic leader in Brooklyn. And I even sat Flo Ziegfeld and Earl Carroll next to each other. Later on, they both told me that they never met before, and they couldn't believe they actually liked each other. Bill Vair, the Republican boss of Pennsylvania, was damn glad to get the tickets from me. Later on, he made the mistake of trying to be a senator instead of just making them. Naturally, he got elected. Then the Senate in Washington threw him out.
Charlie Luciano ensured his rise to prominence wasn't a solitary achievement. On the night of the Dempsey-Firpo fight, he didn't just secure a personal victory. He made it a showcase for the power and unity of his inner circle. His closest allies in organized crime were seated beside him, dressed impeccably and radiating authority. Together they formed a united front, leaving no question about who controlled the shadows of New York. Frank Costello exuded effortless charm. Meyer Lansky radiated quiet intellect. Joe Adonis brought his flair for the dramatic, and Albert Anastasia's menacing presence was unmistakable. Their placement wasn't just strategic, it was symbolic. This wasn't just a group of powerful men. It was a network that bridged the underworld and high society. Their collective influence, displayed so openly, sent a clear message. Luciano wasn't merely connected. He was the center of a web that spanned both power and crime. Charlie, always eager to revel in the limelight, took pride in the company he kept. "Look around," he'd say with a confident grin, gesturing toward the stands filled with politicians, businessmen, and crime bosses. "These are the people who matter. And they're all here because of me." For Luciano, the night wasn't just about showing off. It was about cementing his legacy. Every handshake, every nod of acknowledgement reinforced his status as the man who didn't just play the game, but defined it. The event wasn't just for the public. It was a rallying point for his crew. Luciano's ability to navigate seamlessly between crime and high society wasn't just his victory. It was a triumph for everyone who aligned with him. By bringing his team into the spotlight, he demonstrated the strength of their collective power. The fight wasn't just a spectacle. It was the unveiling of a new order, one where Charlie Luciano stood firmly at the top. As the crowd dispersed and the lights dimmed, one truth was undeniable. Luciano wasn't just a kingpin. He was a leader, a visionary, and the architect of a future where the lines between the underworld and society's elite blurred under his control. The night wasn't just a triumph for Luciano. It was the beginning of an era.
Of course, I invited guys on our side too. The whole bunch from Philly was there, and a lot of guys like King Solomon from Boston, who took care of our shipments from Bronfman in Canada. We give Capone a dozen seats, but he did not give a pair to Johnny Torrio, the selfish son of a bitch, so I had Johnny Torrio sit next to me in my row. Al was 3 rows behind us, and he was sore as a boil. My 200 seats mixed up everybody from whores to politicians, from society to Delancey Street. I had made up my mind I was going to make friends from everywhere.
Charlie Luciano had reached a pinnacle of power few could imagine. Commanding respect across the underworld and the upper echelons of society, he had become a figure of undeniable influence. The Dempsey-Firpo fight had solidified his status as one of New York's most powerful men, his network extending seamlessly from politicians and businessmen to the shadowy corridors of organized crime. It was in this atmosphere of dominance that Salvatore Maranzano approached Luciano once more, this time with a seemingly refined proposal. Maranzano's tone was measured, almost deferential, recognizing that Luciano was no longer just a rising player, but a formidable power. He framed the meeting as an opportunity too good to refuse. Luciano, emboldened by his recent successes, met the approach with skepticism. "If this is like the last offer, don't waste my time," he snapped, his confidence on full display. Maranzano, unfazed, insisted the proposal was different, setting a meeting at his downtown Little Italy headquarters near the Brooklyn Bridge. Ever cautious, Luciano brought Frank Costello, his trusted ally and a non-Sicilian, to test Maranzano's supposed inclusivity. To their surprise, Maranzano welcomed them both warmly, even expressing satisfaction at Costello's presence. It was a calculated move to disarm Luciano and set the stage for his pitch. Maranzano began by emphasizing their shared interests, calling the ongoing violence between their factions foolish and costly. He spoke of cooperation, an end to bloodshed, and a united front in the whiskey markets. But Luciano, impatient with the lecture, cut him off. "Get to the point," he said sharply, his tone cutting through the facade of diplomacy. Maranzano, maintaining his polished demeanor, finally made his offer. He proposed that Luciano join his family, not as an equal, but as a favorite son. The word hung in the air, and Luciano's expression darkened. The term, whether intentional or not, was condescending. To Luciano, it was a dismissal of his hard-won power, a reminder of subordination rather than partnership. For a man who had built his empire from the ground up, the suggestion felt like an insult, a claim that Maranzano believed Luciano's success still needed guidance. The term son belittled him, a subtle yet stinging reminder that Maranzano saw him as someone to be shaped, not respected. It was a misstep that struck deeply. In that moment, Luciano's decision was made. He left the meeting with a polite smile, but his simmering anger was unmistakable. To Luciano, this wasn't just a slight, it was a catalyst. Maranzano's words had confirmed what Charlie already suspected. The old guard had no place for him as an equal. If Maranzano couldn't respect him, Luciano would find a way to make sure the word bambino never crossed his lips again. For Charlie Luciano, the meeting wasn't a negotiation. It was a turning point. Maranzano's time at the top was running out, and Luciano was already imagining how to dismantle the old system and build a new order, one where no man could question his authority.
What right did that prick have to try and take the place of my old man? It was one thing to make a deal, and something else to play Papa with me. In Italian, Papa means Pope. He was playing the same goddamn game with me all over again. I could have shot him at that minute.
Charlie Luciano, ever the strategist, masked his growing frustration with a veneer of calm as he listened to Salvatore Maranzano's latest offer. The proposal was enticing on the surface. Luciano would become Maranzano's chief lieutenant, handed control of his entire liquor territory. Maranzano promised to step away from the business entirely, giving Luciano and his crew free rein. "With this one move," Maranzano said with a tone of finality, "you'll be the king of whiskey." Luciano, however, wasn't easily impressed. He cut through the lengthening conversation with a sharp remark, locking eyes with Maranzano. "You're talking like we're on top of some Sicilian mountain," he said, his voice measured but firm. "Let's just get down to business. What do you want from me?" Maranzano, undeterred, chuckled softly. "The young are always in a hurry," he said, brushing off the comment as though Luciano's directness was just youthful impatience. He continued, outlining the terms with precision. While the deal sounded reasonable, there was a catch, one that revealed the true nature of Maranzano's offer. All proceeds from the whiskey trade would go into a common treasury, controlled and distributed equally by Maranzano himself. Luciano would receive a reasonable cut, as Maranzano put it, but nothing extravagant. It was clear who would hold the real power in this arrangement. Then came the darker side of the deal. Maranzano hinted that with the elimination of a few men, the whiskey business could expand even further. One name stood out: Ciro Terranova, the so-called Artichoke King. Terranova wasn't just a major figure in organized crime. He was an obstacle Maranzano wanted removed. The implication was obvious. Luciano would be expected to play a role in neutralizing him. Luciano leaned back, his mind racing. Maranzano's proposal was wrapped in promises of power, but it came with strings attached. Strings that would leave him beholden to a man he was beginning to resent. The suggestion of a common treasury was nothing more than a veiled attempt to control the proceeds of Luciano's hard work. And the talk of eliminating Terranova? It wasn't a deal. It was a test of loyalty, a move designed to see if Luciano would dance to Maranzano's tune. Charlie weighed his options carefully, all while keeping his expression unreadable. He understood that refusing Maranzano outright could spark a dangerous rivalry, but the offer itself revealed Maranzano's true intentions. This wasn't about partnership, it was about control. Luciano knew he couldn't trust Maranzano. The insult of being called a son was still fresh, and now he was being asked to play the role of a pawn in someone else's game. Charlie might have hidden his anger, but the wheels in his mind were already turning. Maranzano didn't see it yet, but this meeting had just sealed his fate. Charlie wasn't going to play by the old rules. Not now, not ever.
All during his speech, he was walking around the room. When he finished, he turned to us like he was expecting us to applaud him, like he was wearing a toga and just finished one of them big orations in the Roman Senate. That is the way he always made me feel, like he was Caesar, and I was shit. Frank and I just sat there and we did not say nothing.
Maranzano, sensing the tension in the room, decided to back off for the moment. Recognizing that Luciano wasn't ready to commit, he offered a diplomatic out. "Think it over," he said with a cordial smile. "You and your men can take your time and let me know." Charlie, keeping his composure, acknowledged the offer with a polite nod. But inside he was seething. He wanted to reject the deal outright, but he knew he couldn't make that decision alone, not without consulting the men who made up his trusted inner circle. Luciano and Costello left the meeting with a veneer of civility, promising to discuss Maranzano's proposal with the crew. In truth, the polite response was little more than a stalling tactic. Back at the Claridge, Luciano convened his trusted partners: Meyer Lansky, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, Frank Scalise, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and Johnny Torrio. This was the brain trust of his burgeoning empire, a mix of visionaries and enforcers who had helped Charlie rise to the top. As they gathered around the table, Luciano laid out Maranzano's proposal in full detail: the position of chief lieutenant, control of the liquor market, and the elimination of rivals like Ciro Terranova. But he didn't hold back on the strings attached, emphasizing the common treasury and the thinly veiled attempt at control. "It's a polite way of saying he wants us to work for him," Charlie said, his tone sharp. The room erupted into discussion. Joe Adonis, ever the pragmatist, turned to Frank Costello. "Frank," he asked, leaning forward, "what's your take? How do we play this?" Costello, who had been quietly considering the proposal, finally spoke. "It's a hell of a deal on paper," he admitted, his measured tone drawing everyone's attention. "Maranzano offering this to someone who's not Sicilian. That's not just unusual, it's unheard of. He's trying to show flexibility, maybe even compromise." The room murmured in agreement, but there was an undercurrent of skepticism. Costello's point was valid, but so was the unspoken question: was Maranzano really offering flexibility, or was it a trap? Luciano didn't miss a thing. As the conversation flowed, he kept a close eye on Meyer Lansky, who had been unusually quiet. For Charlie, Lansky's opinion mattered most. More than anyone else, Lansky had the analytical mind and the long-term vision to see past the surface of any deal. Charlie waited, watching Lansky's reaction carefully, knowing that when Lansky finally spoke, his words would carry weight. The room buzzed with arguments, possibilities, and warnings, but one thing was clear. This decision would shape the future of their organization. Luciano listened intently, weighing every word, knowing that whatever choice they made, it would need to be unanimous. This wasn't just about business or loyalty. It was about survival, power, and the world they wanted to build.
I looked at my smart friends, and I could see that everybody agreed with Frank except Lansky. "So, little man," I said, "what is on your mind?" Meyer says, "It stinks." Everybody got all excited. Frank was sore as hell and turned on Lansky. Frank says to Meyer, "Even with that adding machine head of yours, you can count the dough we can all make in this setup." I stopped him there and I said to all of them, "What is wrong with you guys? Don't you know the deal will not last 2 days? You do not have to be a big brain or an adding machine or nothing else to know that the minute we join up with Maranzano, that fat old son of a bitch will have us knocked off."
Charlie's insight was sharp and catalytic, setting the room's tone. His words carried a weight that even Meyer Lansky, ever pragmatic, acknowledged with a nod. But it was Vito Genovese who shattered the tense silence with a chilling observation. Maranzano wouldn't allow a man like Luciano to roam unchecked. If he didn't already fear Charlie's intellect, he certainly feared his ambition. The implication was clear as the crew exchanged glances. Would they remain subordinates or dare to rise? It was a pivotal moment, demanding unity and clarity. Charlie, always the leader, leaned forward and posed the question that cut through the noise. Do we fear this man? His tone was calm, but the question was anything but casual. It wasn't just about Maranzano. It was about their future, and whether they were ready to confront a threat head-on. Maranzano was no ordinary rival. He was entrenched, powerful, with deep Sicilian ties and loyal enforcers. Challenging him risked everything. Benny Siegel, ever brash, was the first to speak. Fresh off their recent triumph at the Dempsey fight, his swagger reflected the audacity of youth and his idolization of Al Capone. "It's simple," Benny said, his voice crackling with adrenaline. "We blast him, the way Capone blasted O'Banion. No one questioned Capone after that, no one dared. We send the same message." Charlie studied Benny's fiery response. He admired the young man's boldness, but understood the fine line between confidence and recklessness. Capone's hit on O'Banion had been effective, but it also plunged Chicago into chaos. A knee-jerk act of violence wouldn't suffice here. Finally, Lansky spoke, his calm voice breaking the silence. "If we act, it has to be the right move at the right time. Maranzano's not just a man. He's a symbol. Taking him out means more than killing. It means reshaping everything." The weight of Lansky's words sank in. This wasn't just about Maranzano. It was about the future of organized crime itself. Charlie leaned back, his mind racing. Benny's passion was undeniable, but Lansky's logic was irrefutable. "Benny's right about one thing," Charlie said. "If we act, no one can question it. But this isn't Chicago, and we're not Capone. We don't just blast him. We outmaneuver him. We take everything he has and make it ours. That's how we win." The room fell silent again, the crew absorbing the gravity of the decision. Charlie had asked if they feared Maranzano, and the answer was clear. They didn't. But they respected the danger. Their next move wouldn't just define their future. It would redefine the rules of the game itself.
This was typical Benny. He loved to fight, and he did not care who with. He was ready to go in swinging. Of course, I did not want to take on Maranzano in a fight right then, but I knew that sooner or later, Maranzano would have to go. If he was alive, he would stand in our way. My way to the top, but when I took him on, it was going to be on my terms.
Charlie Luciano's refusal to join Salvatore Maranzano's family was a masterclass in diplomacy. Courteous, respectful, yet unyielding. With Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Joe Adonis by his side, Luciano was thriving, steering a profitable empire built on loyalty and sharp strategy. Yet, Maranzano wasn't the only obstacle between Charlie and the summit of organized crime. Charlie and his crew braced for the expected fallout. Retaliation was the mafia's language, hijackings, ambushes, maybe even war. But what came next wasn't war. It was silence. No attacks, no sabotage, no vanishing allies. Maranzano's lack of response was unsettling, like the eerie calm before a storm. Even stranger was Maranzano's behavior in public. At gatherings, he greeted Charlie with politeness, as if the refusal had been a trivial matter. Their exchanges were cordial, surface level, and devoid of tension. To outsiders, they appeared as two powerful men coexisting peacefully. But Luciano and his crew knew better. Maranzano's silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Was he plotting an attack, waiting for the right moment? Or was he trying to lull them into complacency? The uncertainty gnawed at them, keeping their guard high. For Charlie, the enigma deepened. Maranzano wasn't one to overlook defiance. Yet here he was, acting as though nothing had happened. Was this miscalculation or a calculated move? In the mafia, silence spoke louder than threats. Luciano knew that the absence of conflict didn't mean peace. It meant the battle had taken a form he hadn't yet discerned. For now, all he could do was wait, watch, and ensure his crew stayed sharp and ready.
I could not understand why he did not just have us bumped off, or at least to try to then when we were still small potatoes. He had the boys to do it and there was plenty of opportunities, but he never moved. It was the muscle, I think, that was what scared us bad in the beginning, when nothing happened, and we just sat there and waited for him to lower the boom. Then we got mad and we said, "Screw him. We take our chances."
Charlie Luciano's rejection of Maranzano's second offer sent shockwaves through the underworld. In a realm where defiance often met swift and brutal retaliation, Maranzano's silence was as unexpected as it was unsettling. Yet the lack of response only bolstered Luciano's stature. His refusal wasn't merely an act of defiance. It was a bold declaration of independence that commanded attention far beyond New York. Suddenly, Luciano found himself admired by allies he hadn't expected. Among them were the Mangano brothers, Philip and Vincent, whose growing respect for Luciano added intrigue to his rising influence. The waves of his decision reached as far as Atlantic City, where Enoch Nucky Johnson, the undisputed king of the Jersey underworld, extended his regards. Others followed suit. Mo Dalitz and John Scalise sent tokens of their respect, while Cleveland's most influential bootleggers invited Luciano into their lucrative networks. Even Canada's liquor barons, including Sam Bronfman and Louis Rosensteel, shared their profits, signaling that Luciano's reach was no longer confined to New York. These alliances, profitable in their time, would prove prophetic when Bronfman and Rosensteel later legitimized their empire through the Schenley Corporation. Luciano's growing power came with complications. His rise caught the eye of Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masseria, the self-proclaimed boss of bosses, a figure of greed and insatiable ambition. Opposite him stood Salvatore Maranzano, a calculated strategist with dreams of consolidating power under his rule. Between them was Luciano, a rising star, unwittingly caught in their looming clash. The first tremors of the brewing war came from the Bronx, where Dutch Schultz, acting as an envoy for Tom Gaetano Reyna, approached Luciano at the Claridge Hotel. Schultz's entourage, which included Vito Genovese, carried an air of uneasy diplomacy. Reyna, a respected Sicilian power in the Bronx, expressed his admiration for Luciano, hoping to meet the man whose reputation was spreading like wildfire. While the meeting appeared coincidental, It was later revealed to be orchestrated by Genovese, whose ties to Masseria positioned him as a key player in this unfolding drama. The encounter bridged Luciano to Masseria's circle, whether he welcomed it or not. Luciano's operations, particularly his ticket business, placed him at the center of New York's social scene. These events, often fueled by bootleg liquor and high spirits, became arenas for both camaraderie and veiled negotiations. Luciano frequently found himself crossing paths with Joe the Boss at such gatherings. Though their interactions appeared cordial, the subtext was unmistakable. An inevitable reckoning loomed. Between Masseria's ambition and Maranzano's schemes, Luciano's position at the crossroads of power was undeniable. His next move wouldn't just shape his own destiny, it would alter the course of the underworld forever.
It was the same kind of situation that took place between Maranzano and me and Costello a couple of months before, except for one big difference. Masseria did not have the background and the education of a guy like Maranzano. He did not have no culture. So between being short, fat, and having a round face that was first cousin to a pig, the words that come out of his kisser was rough and straight to the point. He hated Maranzano's fucking guts, and knew Maranzano felt the same way about him.
The meeting took place in a plain second-floor office above an unassuming restaurant, chosen for its discretion rather than comfort. Charlie Luciano sat across from Giuseppe, Joe the Boss Masseria, the air thick with unspoken tension. Masseria's eyes flitted constantly to the window, his paranoia palpable, though it did little to diminish the weight of his presence. He was a man of brevity and wasted no time addressing the matter at hand. "Maranzano's not your ally," Masseria said bluntly. "He's keeping you in check, waiting to deal with me. And once I'm gone, you're next." His voice carried no trace of hesitation, his warning striking with the force of inevitability. Charlie nodded, revealing his upcoming meeting with Maranzano and likening their predicament to a tale of Julius Caesar and betrayal. But Masseria, growing impatient, dismissed the analogy with a sharp rebuke. "Maranzano's playing a dangerous game," he snapped. "When are you going to wake up?" He leaned forward, his piercing stare locking onto Charlie. "You're alive because of the younger generation. They're loyal to you, not him. Without their support, Maranzano's finished. That's the only reason he hasn't made a move yet." The realization struck Charlie like a bolt. His influence wasn't just a liability, it was his strongest shield. Masseria's pitch came next, delivered with blunt force. "You want the city? The country? I'll give it to you. Need money? You'll have more than you can count. Just give me the word." Masseria's directness was a rarity among the old Sicilian bosses, and his fluent English only emphasized the clarity of his intent. He wanted an alliance, not as equals, but as co-conspirators against their mutual enemy, Maranzano. The temptation was undeniable, but Charlie's instincts urged caution. Masseria's offer promised immense power, but it came with heavy strings attached. Aligning with him meant binding himself to a man whose paranoia and heavy-handed methods had already made him a target. For all the allure of the deal, Charlie couldn't ignore the risks. As the conversation continued, a revelation solidified in Charlie's mind. Men like Masseria and Maranzano, with their fixation on tradition and fear of change, represented a crumbling order. The future belonged to men like Charlie, adaptable, strategic, and unafraid to blend tradition with modernity. Respectfully, Charlie nodded at Masseria's words, playing the part of a cautious ally. Yet in his heart, he knew this was his moment. If he could navigate the treacherous waters between Masseria and Maranzano, he wouldn't just survive, he'd emerge as the architect of a new underworld. This wasn't just about avoiding the storm, it was about commanding it.
Maybe it was right at that minute when I knew that eventually both of these guys had to go. We already been talking about rubbing out Maranzano when the time come. But this meet with Masseria made it clear to me that these two guys eventually would try to carve me up. I had to have time, and so I stalled. I told him it was not the right time. I had a lot of things being developed that involved all my guys, and I had to talk to them. He beefed a lot about it, about me not going in with him right then and there, but I was not going to get caught into no squeeze play. I knew I could do more and go further by being independent and free, and let the two of them kiss my ass for a while, until I was sure that I could not stall them no longer. The best I could do was to walk a tightrope and keep the door open a little bit.
The contrast between Luciano's dealings with Masseria and his encounters with Maranzano was stark, but the challenges of his enterprise remained relentless. Setbacks were inevitable, yet they always carried a sting. Several of his trucks, laden with valuable Scotch, were hijacked in the Jersey woods en route to Philadelphia, while federal prohibition agents staged devastating raids on 2 of his warehouses. These blows weren't unexpected. They were the risks of the life he had chosen. But the fallout, this time, was severe. The losses created a shortage of Scotch, a cornerstone of Luciano's operation and reputation. For a man known to always deliver, this shortfall was more than an inconvenience. It was a crack in his armor. Enemies would exploit it, and the threat of losing trust among his customers loomed heavily over him. Just as the pressure reached its peak, a lifeline appeared. A call from Nucky Johnson in Atlantic City changed everything. An invitation from Nucky was no mere courtesy. It was a summons, carrying the weight of a royal decree. Nothing in Atlantic City moved without Nucky's approval. He controlled the city's politics, commerce, and criminal underworld with precision. Liquor flowed into Atlantic City under his watchful eye, with the beachfront serving as a gateway to his empire. His reach extended into the woods where abandoned cabins had been converted into warehouses and distilleries, all at his disposal for the right price. Neutrality was Nucky's hallmark. Personal entanglements had no place in his dominion. To defy him was to invite ruin, a reality no one dared to test. For Luciano, the timing of Nucky's call couldn't have been better. With his supply chain crippled, he needed Nucky's influence to stabilize his operation. Together with Joe Adonis, Luciano made the 140-mile journey to Atlantic City. The back roads they traveled were well-worn paths, routes they'd taken countless times before. In just under 3 hours, they arrived in Chelsea, an exclusive enclave where Nucky maintained a discreet property for private meetings. The house was stately, yet understated, reflecting Johnson's calculated approach to power. As Luciano and Adonis pulled up, the weight of their recent troubles seemed to lift. This wasn't just a meeting about Scotch. It was about alliances, survival, and the unspoken rules that held their world together. Inside, the promise of a deal loomed large. Luciano understood that Nucky's invitation was about more than logistics. It was about respect and maintaining the delicate balance of power. The hijackings and raids had shaken Luciano's enterprise, but this meeting offered a chance to rebuild and climb higher. For Charlie Luciano, every challenge was an opportunity, and under Nucky's shadow, this meeting could prove to be the turning point he needed.
I knew Nucky would do anything for a quick buck. For a lot of money, I figured he could be tempted to accept an offer. The boys and I had decided a good idea. So I said to him, "Look, Nucky, I do not want to beat around the bush, and I am not to chisel a sharp deal. I need all the Scotch I can lay my hands on, and you know everything that's coming in and out. Now I want a better deal than the fair shakes you have been giving everybody. I will make you a partner."
Nucky Johnson radiated calm authority, his relaxed demeanor masking the calculated mind at work. It was clear to Charlie Luciano why he had been summoned to Atlantic City. This was no courtesy call. Nucky had a proposition, and from the moment he rose from his seat, the balance of power in the room shifted. "I'll grant you exclusivity on my beach," Nucky declared, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "No one else can make landfall here. You'll have protection all the way to the Camden Ferry, crossing into Philly. Costello can bring in as many slot machines as he wants. As for gambling, we'll discuss the details later, but they'll be set up near the top hotels. Now, Charlie, what's in it for me? The offer was substantial, a testament to Nucky's confidence and the stakes at hand. Charlie, wasting no time, responded with equal urgency. I need scotch, he said plainly. Where's the next shipment coming from? Nucky didn't miss a beat. Maranzano, he replied, with a flicker of amusement. A boatload and 2 trucks full of uncut merchandise will be landing in Ventnor 2 nights from now. Waxy Gordon and Bitsy Bits in Philadelphia are set to handle the cutting. With the air of a man who planned 3 steps ahead, Nucky retrieved a map and spread it across the table. He pointed to Ventnor and began tracing the route the Maranzano trucks would take. Here's how it goes. They'll land in Ventnor, unload at the docks, and take the back roads through Egg Harbor. These roads are quiet, perfect for keeping things under wraps. Once they're out of Atlantic City territory, it's up to you. Charlie and Adonis leaned over the map, their eyes fixed on the route. It was a golden opportunity, a chance not just to secure the scotch he so desperately needed, but also to disrupt Maranzano's operations and remind him that Charlie Luciano wasn't a man to underestimate. Nucky leaned back in his chair, watching the gears turn in Charlie's mind. One more thing, he added, his voice carrying a hint of warning. You make a move on those trucks, it's on you. My protection ends where Atlantic City does. Don't drag my name into it. Luciano nodded, the weight of the bargain sinking in. This wasn't just a deal. It was a test. Nucky had handed him the keys to the beach and a blueprint to strike a blow against Maranzano, but the execution was entirely up to Charlie. Success would mean solidifying his alliance with Nucky and furthering his climb to the top. Failure, however, could unravel everything he had built. With the map in hand and the details burned into his memory, Charlie and Adonis prepared to leave. The road ahead was fraught with risk, but it also carried the promise of a decisive victory. For Charlie Luciano, the stakes were higher than ever, and failure was not an option.
After getting information like that, I shook hands with Nucky on the deal. That day I give him 10% of everything as long as Volstead Act remained the law. Everything from my outfit, which was liquor. But the rest, including Costello, Lansky, Siegel, and Adonis, all chipped in, so it was not too big a bite from any one of us. As Joe and me walked to the door, Nucky said something that made me feel pretty good. He said, I like the way you handle yourself. Most of all, I like the way you dress. You're starting to look like a real corporation executive.
As Charlie Luciano stepped into the cool night air, Nucky Johnson paused at the car beside him, a smirk tugging at his lips. That's the smartest move you ever made, he said, his voice deliberate. It's worth millions. The weight of Nucky's words lingered as Charlie moved to execute his plan. That same night, 10 heavily armed men, trusted allies, assembled for the operation. Charlie and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel led the charge in the first car, their faces set with determination. Joe Adonis and Meyer Lansky followed close behind, ever watchful. This wasn't just a heist, it was a gamble against Maranzano himself. If their identities were uncovered, an all-out war could erupt. The convoy reached a stretch of Egg Harbor Road cloaked in darkness, chosen for its seclusion. A felled tree lay across the road, blocking the path like a deliberate warning. As the hum of engines approached, the men tensed. Headlights pierced the night, illuminating the trucks carrying their target. Charlie raised his hand, steady and commanding, signaling his crew to hold their positions. Timing was everything. When the first truck slowed at the obstruction, Siegel sprang into action. His Thompson submachine gun roared, the sharp crack of gunfire shattering the stillness. Muzzle flashes lit his fierce determination. Lansky followed, his shots precise, disabling the vehicle and neutralizing any resistance. The ambush was swift, leaving the drivers with no choice but to comply. Charlie emerged, his presence as commanding as ever. His men secured the trucks, inspecting the cargo with urgency. The sight of uncut whiskey brought a wave of relief. It was exactly what they needed. The operation, executed with precision, underscored Luciano's leadership and the unwavering loyalty of his men. As the trucks turned back under his crew's watchful eyes, Charlie allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. This wasn't just a heist, it was a declaration. To Nucky, to his crew, and to his enemies, it proved Charlie Luciano was a man who delivered, no matter the stakes. Yet, as the convoy disappeared into the night, Charlie's mind remained sharp. The whiskey solved one problem, but the ripples of this move would reach far. Maranzano's silence wouldn't last forever, and when it broke, Charlie would need to be ready. For now, though, the night was his, a hard-fought victory worth savoring.
Siegel started to shoot away, and then Lansky opened. One of the Maranzano guys was bumped off, and another one was wounded, and the rest of them gave up right there. But that did not do them no good because we took away their guns and give them a good beating before we took off with the trucks. The best thing about it was that none of them recognized us because we were all masked.
With the raid behind him, Charlie Luciano was finally able to fill his overdue orders, restoring his reputation as the man who always delivered. The uncut whiskey flowed through his channels, and for the moment, his operations hummed with success. But Charlie's mind wasn't at ease. The heist had been bold, almost brazen, and he was certain Salvatore Maranzano would have some idea of who was responsible. The old Don wasn't a fool, and Charlie fully expected a swift and forceful retaliation. But once again, Maranzano's response was silence. No hijackings, no ambushes, no bloodshed. It was as if the heist hadn't happened. The lack of retaliation was unnerving, a quiet tension that hung over Luciano and his men like a storm cloud refusing to break. Charlie was prepared for war, his crew ready to defend their turf, but nothing came. It wasn't like Maranzano to let a slight of this magnitude go unanswered, or so Charlie thought. The truth was, Maranzano wasn't planning to use violence to win this battle. Instead, he chose a strategy that confounded Luciano. Patience. Maranzano's plan wasn't to strike back, but to wait. He believed that Charlie, with his ambition and growing influence, would eventually find his way back to him, not as an adversary, but as an ally. The old Don understood that brute force wouldn't sway Luciano. If anything, it would only strengthen Charlie's resolve to defy him. Maranzano's play was subtler, more insidious. By doing nothing, he hoped to leave Luciano in a state of uncertainty, forcing him to question every move, every alliance, every shipment. It was a long game, one that required restraint, a quality Maranzano prided himself on. Charlie, for his part, wasn't fooled by the silence. He knew Maranzano's inaction was deliberate, a calculated effort to unsettle him. And while Charlie outwardly projected confidence, the absence of retaliation left him uneasy. If Maranzano wasn't striking back, then what was he planning? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he refused to let it show. Luciano's mind turned over the possibilities. Maranzano wasn't a man to be underestimated, and Charlie knew he had to stay ahead of whatever the old Don was plotting. The heist had given him a temporary win, but it also set the stage for a larger conflict, one that would determine the future of New York's underworld. For now, the silence held, and Charlie used the time to strengthen his position. He expanded his networks, reinforced his alliances, and ensured that his crew remained loyal and sharp. But in the back of his mind, he knew the storm wasn't over, it was just waiting for the right moment to break. And when it did, Charlie Luciano intended to be ready.
That is when I knew that Joe Masseria had called it right. I knew then that I would go with Masseria, no matter how much I hated him personally. Maranzano could never take on the combination of me and my guys joined together with Joe's big outfit. I decided that I would make the deal with him as soon as possible, but I had to work it out, so he had come to me again, instead of me going to him. That would give me some kind of edge when we started talking.
By the mid-1920s, Charlie Luciano had built an empire before reaching 30. His wealth was immense, his influence vast, and his power wrapped around New York like a silken noose. Living in a luxurious Murray Hill apartment, every corner of his residence reflected refinement and success, from the fine furniture to the art that adorned the walls. His tailored suits spoke of perfection, and an aura of achievement surrounded him. But it was his love for automobiles that revealed his true passion. Luciano maintained a fleet of imposing black, supercharged cars, each customized to his exacting standards. He had a mechanical curiosity that matched his close associate Meyer Lansky's, and the two could spend hours engrossed in discussions about engines and horsepower. Charlie moved effortlessly through high society, mingling with politicians, socialites, and celebrities. Welcomed into the homes of New York's elite, he had mastered the art of charm and sophistication under Arnold Rothstein's mentorship. Yet beneath his polished exterior lay an undeniable edge, a quiet, ever-present reminder of his capacity for violence. People instinctively sensed it. No tailored suit or warm smile could fully mask the danger that clung to him. Luciano didn't call his operation a mafia or gang. To him, it was simply the outfit. It wasn't bound by rigid hierarchies or old-world traditions. Instead, it was a collective of powerful figures, each a leader in their own right. Frank Costello infiltrated politics and greased the wheels of corruption. Meyer Lansky streamlined their finances, turning crime into a business empire. Bugsy Siegel, ruthless and efficient, handled problems with brutal precision. Joe Adonis brought strategy and charm, while Red Levine added an element of fear and loyalty. There were no formal titles. Charlie's leadership was unspoken but absolute, and the shared goal was simple: making money. The outfit thrived during Prohibition, controlling the flow of illegal booze, expanding its reach, and maintaining a stranglehold on corruption. It was a modern organization, unburdened by the narrow-minded rivalries and rigid structures of the Sicilian mafia. Luciano and his crew were visionaries who saw crime as a business to be modernized and scaled. And at the helm of this revolutionary enterprise stood Charlie Luciano, a man who had already rewritten the rules and was poised to shape the future.
In them days there was no real combination. Costello had his outfit, and Siegel and Lansky had their outfit, and Adonis had his. But we all had one thing in common, and that was the whiskey and how to keep it flowing. I never got mixed up with Costello in the slots. I did not go on no fur jobs or jewelry heists with Adonis guys or things like that. Of course, I got my share because at the top we were partners. But it goes to be a thing where they would all look at me, and I would always say to them, "Do not ask me to make your decisions for you in your own business. All I want to do is make the stuff we do together pay off as big as possible." It was a terrific arrangement, and one of the reasons it worked so well was that I was not doing a masseria, trying to be the big boss.
Charlie Luciano never officially named himself boss. He didn't need to. His men naturally gravitated toward him for advice and guidance, recognizing his sharp mind and uncanny ability to navigate any situation. But Charlie wasn't content with running his crew on instinct, alone. He believed in order, structure, and discipline, principles that could elevate his outfit from a band of criminals to a well-oiled machine. To achieve this, he established rules and regulations that rivaled those of a legitimate company, creating an unspoken code of conduct that every member was expected to follow. The first rule was simple: caution. Charlie emphasized the importance of being circumspect in everything they did. He drilled into his men that even the smallest mistake could have disastrous consequences. For instance, when traveling by car, there were to be no speeding violations, ever. "You never know who's carrying a gun in the car," he warned. A routine stop by the police could easily escalate into a disaster. There was also an unwritten rule that no one could simply walk away from the outfit. To quit was to betray the group, and betrayal was something Charlie dealt with swiftly and decisively. A firing, in the world of the outfit, wasn't just unpleasant. It could be permanent. Charlie's rules extended beyond behavior to appearances. His men were instructed to dress neatly and conservatively, blending into the crowd like office workers or professionals. Wide-brimmed hats, loud shirts, bright ties, and flashy suits were strictly prohibited. Charlie understood that attention invited scrutiny, and scrutiny was the enemy of success. "Look sharp," he told his men, "but don't stand out. We don't want to be remembered for the wrong reasons." Despite the rules, some men inevitably took risks, cutting corners or acting recklessly. For Charlie, this was unacceptable. His vision for the outfit required discipline and adherence to the code. In his words, "This isn't about looking like big shots. It's about being smart. Every time you dress loud or act like a fool, you're giving someone a reason to look closer at you and closer at us. Keep your head down, do the job, and keep the money rolling in. If you want to play cowboy, find another outfit. But if you stay, you play by my rules. Simple as that." Charlie's expectations weren't just rules. They were a blueprint for survival in a dangerous game. He knew that appearances mattered, that caution saved lives, and that discipline kept the machine running. It wasn't about stifling ambition or individuality. It was about creating a system that could withstand the pressures of their world. And under Charlie Luciano's leadership, that system thrived.
I started making our outfit into a real business, like any big corporation. Of course, we could not advertise with a slogan or a trademark like Packard cars, "Ask the man who owns one," but that did not mean things could not be run right. So I made a lot of rules for the guys who worked for me. Why shouldn't I? Don't department stores and big offices tell their people how to behave and what to wear?
Charlie Luciano had a simple philosophy for his men. Don't take unnecessary risks. There were countless ways to earn money now, with their operations expanding across liquor, gambling, unions, and more. But with success came growth, and growth brought complications. As the crew expanded, the available work wasn't always enough to satisfy everyone. Competition within the ranks created tension, and tensions bred mistakes that Charlie couldn't afford. To address these challenges, Charlie established clear rules, not just for the rank and file, but for the bosses who led their crews. He understood that leadership wasn't just about giving orders, it was about taking responsibility. One of his most important rules was that bosses had to back their men. If one of their members got into legal trouble, it was the boss's duty to support them, no matter the cost. "You back your guys to the hilt," Charlie told them. "When they go down, we make sure they know we're standing with them. That's how you keep loyalty. That's how you keep a crew together." The rule wasn't just about loyalty, it was strategic. Charlie knew that a member who felt abandoned would be more likely to flip under pressure, cutting deals with law enforcement to save themselves. But a member who knew the outfit had their back would keep their mouth shut, no matter the heat. Charlie's insistence on avoiding unnecessary risks was another cornerstone of his leadership. He wanted his men to think before they acted, to understand that the long game was more valuable than any short-term score. "There's no need for heroics," he'd remind them. "We've got plenty of ways to make money. Don't do something stupid just to make a name for yourself. You'll make a name by doing the job right and keeping your head down." But as the outfit grew, so did the challenges. Some men, frustrated by the lack of work or eager to prove themselves, began taking risks anyway. Small-time robberies, reckless hijackings, and hasty decisions threatened to unravel the careful order Charlie had built. He dealt with these infractions swiftly, using a mix of discipline and mentorship to keep his crew in line. "We're not just a gang," he'd say. "We're a business. Businesses don't run on chaos. They run on rules. You follow the rules, you stay in the game. You don't, you're out. It's that simple. Charlie's rules created a culture of discipline and loyalty within the outfit. His crew knew they could count on their bosses for support, but they also knew that support came with expectations. Risk-taking wasn't just discouraged, it was seen as a betrayal of the system Charlie had built. And under his leadership, that system became the foundation of one of the most powerful criminal enterprises in American history.
I tried to explain to all the boys in my outfit that there were lots of ways to make $1. There was no reason to go out on their own and take chances just because they might have a couple of days or weeks on their hands with no jobs to do for me.
Charlie Luciano understood the importance of loyalty, both giving it and receiving it. He made it a cornerstone of his leadership, drilling into his men the necessity of avoiding risks. But no matter how often he emphasized caution, there were always a few who couldn't resist testing the limits. When they got caught, it became Charlie's burden to set things right. Charlie had a standing rule: no man gets left behind. Whether it was a minor scrape or a long sentence, Charlie assured his men that the outfit would do everything in its power to get them out of prison. He knew the importance of this promise. For men living under the constant shadow of the law, the assurance of support was a lifeline. It kept them loyal, bound to the code of omerta. Luciano often reminded his crew, "If you end up in a cell, don't worry, we'll get you out. But don't mistake that for a free pass to be stupid." He pressed upon them to learn from their mistakes. Repeated offences, especially those born of carelessness, were dealt with harshly. Charlie made sure everyone understood the penalties for recklessness, not just to maintain order, but to ensure that his crew operated with the efficiency and discipline of a professional enterprise. By the summer of 1925, Luciano's operation had grown substantially. His bookmaking ventures were spreading across Manhattan, and with expansion came new challenges. Charlie needed someone ruthless and efficient to bring in the small, independent operations that dotted the city, places like family-owned candy shops and mom-and-pop stores. He handed the task to Vito Genovese, a man whose cunning and tenacity made him perfect for the job. Genovese moved with precision, offering store owners a simple choice: join Luciano's network or be pushed out. For many, the decision was easy. Aligning with the outfit offered protection, resources, and a steady flow of customers. For those who resisted, the consequences were swift and unmistakable. Genovese's reputation alone was often enough to convince the holdouts. Luciano's strategy was clear. By consolidating these small operations, he created a vast, interconnected network that brought in steady revenue while strengthening his grip on the city. At the same time, he reinforced the idea that the outfit was more than just a criminal enterprise. It was a syndicate with rules, discipline, and a safety net for those who played by the code. Through it all, Charlie maintained his position as both a leader and a protector. His men knew that mistakes weren't free, but they also knew they weren't alone. It was this balance of accountability and loyalty that made Luciano's outfit a force to be reckoned with. By 1925, Charlie wasn't just running a crew. He was building an empire. And every move he made, every rule he enforced, brought him one step closer to the top.
I told Vito we were going to do something none of the other outfits ever had the sense to do. We were going to guarantee a guy in any little store a yard and a half, which was $150 a week to handle the betting slips and let us put in the phones.
These small mom-and-pop stores, often run by hard-working Jewish proprietors, were initially wary of Charlie Luciano's reputation. Gangsters represented everything their modest, law-abiding lives avoided. But Charlie's men were persuasive, offering a deal too good to ignore. Luciano promised these stores a steady weekly income of $150, a fortune at the time. The extra income often funded college educations for their children, an otherwise unreachable dream. This strategy wasn't just clever, it was transformative. By embedding gambling into everyday life, Luciano expanded beyond smoky backrooms and hidden dens. Betting became as routine as buying bread. Locals could now place bets at their corner store, removing the stigma of underground gambling. These humble storefronts transformed into bustling hubs of the gambling industry, drawing crowds eager to wager on sporting events. The simplicity of Luciano's operation was genius, solidifying his status as a visionary entrepreneur, even if his business was illegal. However, the lack of oversight exposed many to risk. Children and inexperienced bettors eagerly joined in, unaware of the consequences. For Luciano and his men, profits came first, and the human toll was a necessary cost. Vito Genovese, always looking to innovate, took Luciano's concept further. He turned to another neighborhood staple, snowball cart peddlers. These vendors, beloved by local children, had a direct line to the community. Genovese transformed them into mobile bookmakers, taking bets as they made their rounds. But he didn't stop there. Genovese introduced narcotics to their operations, adding a dark and profitable layer. What began as a clever gambling expansion became tainted by drugs, leaving devastation in its wake. Despite the damage, the ingenuity of Luciano and Genovese's system was undeniable. Ordinary stores and vendors became cogs in a vast empire, innovative, profitable, and ruthless in its pursuit of power and wealth.
Without saying nothing to me, he starts to muscle a bunch of them old geezers, mostly Italians, to pass junk for him in their neighborhoods. I almost clobbered him. I said to him, "You stupid shithead. You had a good idea, but why you screw it up with narcotics? Especially when I told you, no junk. Go out and organize them, sure, but to take bets for us. We all got the precincts protected and feds to worry about." He seen the light. In less than a month, we had over 200 pushcarts making book for us. That was the time, though, when I should have cut his prick off right then and there. Believe me, I lived to regret that.
By the mid-1920s, Charlie Luciano's empire had become a juggernaut, especially in the gambling world. With Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello at his side, Luciano revolutionized bookmaking across Manhattan. They centralized police-protected handbooks into a network of betting banks, pooling losses to mitigate risk and ensure financial stability. The syndicate reportedly brought in over $500,000 a week, a staggering fortune for the era. However, Luciano understood the costs of doing business. A large portion of profits went toward police protection, telephone lines, and overhead expenses. Bookmakers under Luciano's system thrived. They earned a steady $150 per week, far more than the average monthly wage in the 1920s, and received a 7.5% cut of total bets. This incentive plan, carefully crafted by Luciano and Lansky, ensured loyalty and precision. Beyond handbooks, Luciano expanded into lavish horse parlors, catering to New York's elite. These opulent venues combined luxury with thrill, offering patrons fine liquor, sophisticated decor, and live betting updates. Wealthy gamblers frequently wagered not just money, but valuables, gold watches, diamonds, and rare jewels, which often found their way into Luciano's collection. Prohibition, a bane for most, became a windfall for Luciano. He purchased shuttered clubs and transformed them into speakeasies and gambling hubs. These weren't ordinary establishments. They were cutting edge. Luciano installed direct telephone lines to racetracks, giving patrons real-time results while they drank and gambled. These innovations made his venues the pinnacle of New York nightlife, drawing high society to indulge in defiance of the Volstead Act. Luciano's vision extended beyond gambling and bootlegging. His empire encompassed liquor, narcotics, prostitution, banking, politics, labor unions, and real estate. Each venture thrived, embedding him deeper into the fabric of American society. His influence spanned from immigrant neighborhoods to Manhattan's elite, making him a towering force. As Charlie quipped, "I'm bigger than General Motors." But Luciano wasn't finished. His gaze turned to the stock market, a world of risk and wealth that mirrored his own rise. For Charlie, It wasn't just a new frontier. It was an opportunity to redefine the scope of his empire. He wasn't playing the game. He was rewriting it.
I always liked to gamble, but one thing I never did: gamble in the stock market, because the stockholder on the outside do not know a thing about what is happening inside the company. Years later, I was down at Bradley's in Florida, and I ran into that guy Hutton who had a big brokerage firm up in New York. Hutton was a good friend of mine. He was playing chemin de fer one night, and when he finished, I think he dropped 18 grand. I went over to him and I said, with an absolutely straight face, "Hut, I want to talk to you. I want to help you get even for what you just dropped. It is something about the market. It is a good idea if I could get my outfit listed on the New York Stock Exchange." For a minute, he really started to think about it, and then he realized I was kidding him. Well, he began to laugh until I thought he was going to choke. Then he looked at me, shook his head, and said, "Charlie, that is the greatest idea I have ever heard in my whole life, that I will never be able to accomplish."
What Charlie Luciano quickly learned from his ventures was a simple but profound truth. People craved the thrill of betting just as much as they desired a stiff drink. This realization opened a floodgate of opportunity. It wasn't enough to simply offer one or the other. Charlie understood. The true power lay in combining the two vices. The back rooms of his speakeasies, particularly those in outlying roadhouses beyond the city's immediate reach, transformed into fully equipped casinos. These weren't mere afterthoughts or makeshift operations. The casinos were outfitted with everything to entice gamblers. Roulette wheels spun under dim, smoky lights. Craps tables attracted crowds with the promise of quick fortunes, and blackjack tables became hotspots for those willing to test their luck and skill. Alongside these staples were countless other games of chance, each designed to ensure that no one left without feeling the allure of risking it all. And the money, it poured in like a torrent. Liquor and gambling, two of the most lucrative underground industries, were now perfectly intertwined. Patrons came for the illicit drinks, drawn to the allure of forbidden indulgence during Prohibition. Once inside, the intoxicating mix of alcohol and gambling created an atmosphere that was impossible to resist. The more people drank, the looser their wallets became, and the tables saw a steady flow of cash that seemed endless. For Luciano, it was the perfect formula, a seamless integration of vice and enterprise. Liquor softened inhibitions, gambling heightened adrenaline. Together, they created a potent mix that fueled both his bank accounts and his burgeoning reputation. This was more than business. It was an empire in the making. Charlie's vision had not only turned Prohibition into a golden opportunity, but had also laid the foundation for a network of operations that catered to the primal desires of a restless society. It was all coming together, and for Charlie Luciano, the realization of his strategy was nothing short of genius. Liquor and gambling, it was a hell of a mix, and Charlie was just getting started.
Around 1925, I had a take of at least $12 million from alcohol alone for the year. Naturally, we did not pay any business taxes like General Motors, but that did not mean that our expenses were not pretty heavy. We, by that I mean with Costello, Lansky, Siegel, and Adonis, had a payroll of about 100 guys, lots of them muscle men or enforcers and guards. We had good drivers, bookkeepers, lots of messengers, and we even used to pay off a bunch of fingermen who lined up jobs like a hijacking or a robbery. In the days when an honest department store was drawing down maybe $25 a week at most, my guys was getting paid by us $200 a week, plus what they were making on their own. So we had a yearly payroll of about $1 million.
While the street guys were paid from the steady flow of profits, their payroll was only a fraction of the overall expenses. Behind the scenes, a significant portion of the operation's revenue went toward an entirely different kind of cost: police protection. This wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity, a critical investment in keeping the machinery of Charlie Luciano's empire running smoothly. In a city where law enforcement could easily become an obstacle, Luciano had turned them into an asset. Payments were made regularly, ensuring that raids were tipped off in advance, blind eyes were turned, and inconvenient questions never made it past the precinct doors. It wasn't just about protection from the law. These payments secured a layer of insulation between the outfit and rival factions. When conflicts arose, having key figures in law enforcement on the payroll gave Luciano a strategic edge. A cop looking the other way could be the difference between a successful shipment and a hijacked truck, between a thriving speakeasy and a shuttered operation. These arrangements weren't cheap. Charlie often described the cost of protection as the price of doing business, one he was willing to pay to keep his empire running without interference. In addition to the police, there were the extras: phone line rentals, bribes to local politicians, and even payoffs to rival gangs to maintain an uneasy peace in certain territories. Every dollar spent was a calculated move, an investment that ensured the outfit's operations could expand without unnecessary friction. Charlie once quipped to his inner circle, "The money doesn't just keep the heat off our backs, it greases the wheels of the whole operation. You pay to stay in the game." It was this understanding of the hidden costs of crime that set Luciano apart. He didn't see the bribes and payoffs as burdens. He saw them as the foundation of his success. For Luciano, it wasn't just about paying off the police. It was about controlling the environment in which his empire thrived. From the street-level enforcers to the men in uniform, everyone had their price. And Charlie made sure they were paid, ensuring his operations ran like a well-oiled machine, untouchable by the very system meant to bring him down.
That meant we had about 11 million left to cover all our expenses. By 1925, all of us guys were paying out a grease of over $100,000 per week, which is more than $5 million a year for protection. Hell, we shoveled out $10,000 a week every week like clockwork to the top brass of the police department, and that was only a small part of it. We had to take care of the precinct too, the captains, the lieutenants, and the sergeants. They all had their hands out. Takers, all of them. And that goes for the police officer on the beat.
By the mid-1920s, after expenses like police protection, bribes, and operational costs, Charlie Luciano and his partners were netting an incredible $4 million annually. This untaxed fortune flowed seamlessly into their coffers, concealed under the guise of legitimate jobs like chauffeurs, gamblers, or sales managers. Prohibition-era liquor was the cornerstone of their empire, but Meyer Lansky saw untapped potential in gambling. While speakeasies and upscale gambling dens catered to the wealthy, Lansky recognized the millions to be made by targeting the working class with small-scale bets like lotteries and horse races. One evening at the grand opening of the Beverly Club in Covington, Kentucky, Lansky shared his transformative idea with Luciano. The club, with its premium liquor and polished elegance, was a testament to their venture's success. But Lansky's focus wasn't on the high-rolling patrons. Instead, he saw potential in the little guy. "What do you want me to do, Meyer? Give them their money back," Charlie joked, watching wealthy patrons lose their fortunes at the roulette wheel. Lansky, undeterred, responded with conviction. "I'm talking about people who can't drop $2 on a horse but still want a piece of the action, even if all they can bet is pennies." That word, pennies, resonated with Luciano. Lansky proposed a revolutionary lottery system tailored for the masses, offering better odds and accessibility. Together they sketched out the details in Cleveland, sipping rye whiskey and ginger ale. The plan was simple yet brilliant. A policy racket where players bet on a 3-digit number ranging from 000 to 999, tied to publicly available figures like stock market closings. With payouts of 600 to 1, it was enticing but still guaranteed huge profits for operators. Lansky and Luciano saw the potential to roll out the scheme in Harlem, where economic hardship made the dream of turning pennies into dollars particularly appealing. Frank Costello was tasked with launching the operation in Harlem, targeting the African-American community. Despite early pushback, from rivals like Dutch Schultz and skepticism from some associates, the policy racket quickly flourished. It gave economically disadvantaged people hope during the bleak days of the Great Depression and became a cornerstone of Luciano's empire. The results were staggering, generating millions even in the 1930s and further cementing Lansky's reputation as a financial mastermind. Together, Luciano and Lansky transformed gambling into an enterprise that reached every corner of society, turning their vision into a highly profitable reality.
Once Meyer spelled out the idea, it all sort of fell into place. He had a way of thinking around a corner. When it was all put together, I knew with every bone in my body it would catch on like grass on fire.
The policy racket exploded into life, ushering in a new era for organized crime. Initially met with skepticism from gangsters like Dutch Schultz, its staggering success soon silenced critics. However, its rapid expansion came with fierce territorial disputes, particularly in Harlem, where the numbers game first took root. These battles weren't just about territory, they were about the massive fortunes at stake. Harlem became the epicenter of the policy racket, transforming into a multi-million-dollar enterprise almost overnight. Every corner store and street vendor became part of the network, and residents, drawn by the simple thrill of betting pennies for the chance to win big, flocked to play. Luciano, ever the strategist, ensured the immense profits were distributed wisely. Shares in policy banks were handed out to his most loyal men, tightening their allegiance and maintaining order as the empire grew. These banks were more than financial hubs. They were battlegrounds in the fight for control. While Charlie and his crew didn't invent the numbers racket, they revolutionized it. Offering better odds, streamlined betting, and the muscle needed to eliminate rivals, they swiftly consolidated their hold. Luciano's associates began by targeting small operators, pushing them out with offers they couldn't refuse, or threats they wouldn't survive. Once the smaller players were dealt with, they moved on to mid-tier operators, gradually consolidating control. The racket's growth was relentless, spreading beyond Harlem to other neighborhoods, cities, and eventually across state lines. By the late 1920s and 1930s, the policy racket had become one of the most profitable criminal enterprises in the country. With millions of untraceable dollars pouring in, Luciano and Meyer Lansky faced a new challenge: managing the wealth. Their solution was as innovative as the racket itself. They laundered money through legitimate businesses, funneled cash into offshore accounts, and created shell companies to obscure the fund's origins. Some of the profits were reinvested to expand operations, ensuring their dominance in the underworld. The policy racket wasn't just a revenue stream. It was a testament to Luciano's vision and leadership. He had transformed a simple numbers game into a national empire, combining brute force with strategic brilliance. As the wealth flowed and their influence spread, Charlie and his associates transcended their roles as gangsters, becoming architects of a criminal empire that redefined what organized crime could achieve.
So much money was coming in from policy banks that we had to have meetings all the time to figure out what to do with the dough. That is when I really started to respect the bankers and to be jealous of them. They could take their depositors' money and invest it so that they could pay interest and still have a healthy profit. But we were raking in hot money that we could not declare and could not bank. Then I remembered all of them poor suckers who could not get a loan from a bank because they did not have no security. That is when I decided to organize the loan business.
Charlie Luciano's ingenuity pushed organized crime beyond its conventional boundaries. In the immigrant communities of the early 20th century, where class divisions and racism left many marginalized, legitimate financial opportunities were scarce. Immigrants, often denied loans due to their lower-class status and lack of collateral, became the perfect targets for a shadow economy. Luciano and his associates, flush with cash from bootlegging and gambling, stepped in to fill the void. They became an unofficial financial institution, offering loans to struggling individuals and businesses. But this wasn't charity. It was business, and a ruthless one. Luciano and his crew embraced the age-old racket of usury, attaching exorbitant interest rates to their loans. Many debtors found themselves trapped, their lives consumed by the endless cycle of repayment. While this racket funneled immense wealth into his empire, Charlie had mixed feelings about its human toll. Years later, after his exile and seeing the dire poverty in Italy, Luciano reflected on the exploitation, regretting the devastation it caused to so many lives. In the 1920s, however, Charlie's focus remained practical. This wealth fueled Italian businesses, paradoxically uplifting and exploiting the same communities. While some mobsters, like Russell Bufalino, used their resources to support families and foster genuine progress, these exceptions were rare. Most of the mafia's operations prioritized profit above all else. Luciano's ambitions extended far beyond loans. He saw untapped potential in controlling industries critical to America's economy. One of his primary targets was the garment industry, plagued by exploitation, but ripe for influence. Banks avoided financing the sector due to its high risks, leaving a gap that Luciano eagerly filled. But his strategy wasn't just about funding, it was about control. Charlie began organizing unions, embedding himself in their leadership and using them to manipulate entire industries. Through these unions, he could demand payments from business owners under the guise of labor negotiations. Ironically, this extortion often improved workers' lives. Wages rose, conditions improved, and workers gained a voice. The unions, while tools of mafia dominance, inadvertently advanced labor rights, giving the working class leverage in industries that had long ignored their needs. This paradox defined Luciano's ventures. While exploiting the vulnerable, he also provided protections and opportunities that legitimate institutions had failed to offer. Organized crime became a force that could simultaneously harm and uplift, cementing its complex relationship with society. Charlie's vision for organized crime wasn't a series of isolated ventures. It was a vast enterprise capable of shaping industries and communities. His influence, for better or worse, blended crime with progress, leaving a mark on America that would resonate for decades to come.
I picked out Tommy L., who they sometimes called Three-Finger Brown after the old baseball pitcher, as the right guy on which I could depend. Tommy and I was friends from the old neighborhood, but for a lot of reasons we did not play that up. We used to meet in private most of the time, and it was not for a long time that a lot of guys knew we was close.
Tommy Lucchese was a quiet architect of organized crime, a man whose alliances with Charlie Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Vito Genovese and others operated in secrecy during the 1920s. His reputation as a power broker was cemented during one of the most pivotal moments in mafia history, the assassination of Salvatore Maranzano. Lucchese's role was crucial. Disguised as tax agents, the hitmen infiltrated Maranzano's office under Tommy's guidance. Lucchese calmly identified Maranzano, stood guard, and ensured the plan's execution. Inside, Maranzano's ambitions ended in a violent struggle of blades and bullets. When it was done, Lucchese confirmed the death and vanished into the chaos of Little Italy. Tommy's loyalty to Luciano was unparalleled. Even during Luciano's exile, he was one of the few men Charlie trusted implicitly. Unlike Meyer Lansky or Vito Genovese, whom Luciano later accused of theft, Tommy remained steadfast. On several occasions, his intelligence saved Luciano from Maranzano's schemes and ensured his rise to power. Lucchese's honesty and discretion made him invaluable, and his influence extended beyond personal loyalty. A visionary, Lucchese strengthened his alliances for the future. His daughter's marriage to Carlo Gambino's son solidified his relationship with Gambino, whom he saw as a natural successor to Luciano's legacy. His operations spanned gambling, extortion, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. His influence reached Louisiana, where he maintained a powerful connection with Carlos Marcello. Lucchese's impact on unions was transformative. Alongside Luigi Lepke Buchalter, he helped Luciano organize and control unions across New York, teaching mob bosses how to wield this power. Their work infiltrated industries, influencing figures like Jimmy Hoffa, and reshaped labor in America. Workers saw better wages and conditions, but these gains came at a price, with the mafia profiting heavily from union control. The Great Depression only tightened the mafia's grip. While legitimate financial systems crumbled, the mob thrived, offering loans with interest rates as high as 1,000%. Borrowers were left with no choice, and the profits further cemented Luciano, Lepke, and Lucchese's dominance. However, Lepke's downfall, marked by erratic behavior and eventual execution in the electric chair, shifted his empire into the hands of the Italian mafia, strengthening the syndicate's control. By the 1960s, Lucchese's power was unparalleled, but failing health forced him into retirement. A key meeting at La Stella restaurant convened figures like Gambino and Colombo to plan the future, though Tommy was absent. He passed away in 1967, leaving behind a legacy of loyalty and strategic brilliance. Lucchese was more than a mobster, he was a force of transformation. From aiding Luciano's rise to orchestrating labor control and industry infiltration, his vision reshaped organized crime. Together with Luciano, he didn't just operate within the underworld, they redefined it, leaving an indelible mark on industries and society.
And we give the companies that worked with us the money to help them with buying goods and all the stuff they needed to operate with. Then, if one of our manufacturers got into us for dough that he could not pay back, and the guy had what looked like a good business, then we would become his partner. If it were not for me, them guys at Samuel Gompers and Jacob Potofsky and Sidney Hillman and Dave Dubinsky, and I knew them all, would have been bums. Me and Tommy and Lepke, we eventually kept a whole bunch of them garment manufacturers alive, and we helped all of them, unions, the Ladies' Garment Works and the Amalgamated, organize the places. If it were not for us, none of them, the manufacturers or the unions, would have no place. Our dough made it possible for 50 manufacturers, maybe more, to cut more dresses and coats and suits than anybody else and petticoats. We backed a guy by the name of Korn, maybe it was Cohen, and a dozen more like him. For Christ's sake, in the 20s, every broad in the United States was wearing a petite coat. I was responsible for putting it on her.
Charlie Luciano remained unbothered by the rising cost of household goods, firmly believing that the public should bear the expense in exchange for the impeccable delivery of products. To him, it was a fair trade. Goods moved efficiently, unimpeded by logistical barriers, and arrived as promised. By the 1950s and 1960s, this philosophy had evolved into something far more pervasive, a hidden cost baked into the American economy, widely known as the mob tax. The concept was simple, but all-encompassing. Every significant business transaction in America, whether legal or illicit, carried an unseen surcharge, a couple of dollars here, a percentage there, that lined the pockets of organized crime. From shipping and construction to entertainment and unions, the mafia had infiltrated so many industries that it was impossible to do business without paying them a cut. This system, born out of Luciano's vision for consolidating power, became a cornerstone of the mob's dominance. Through strategic alliances, control of unions, and extortion rackets, they positioned themselves as silent partners in nearly every facet of commerce. The price tag for their services might have seemed negligible at first, a couple of dollars per transaction, but multiplied across millions of businesses and billions of dollars, it amounted to an economic stranglehold. For consumers, the effects were unavoidable. The cost of goods and services quietly rose, with a hidden portion of every dollar spent funneled into the mafia's coffers. To business owners, it was the price of staying in business. Refusal to pay the mob tax wasn't just bad for profits, it was a threat to survival. Trucks mysteriously failed to arrive, shipments went missing, workers walked off the job, and competitors suddenly gained an edge. The mob ensured that compliance wasn't just encouraged, it was mandatory. This system of economic manipulation wasn't just about making money, it was about control. By embedding themselves in the machinery of American commerce, Luciano and his successors created a network of influence that reached into the highest levels of society. Politicians, union leaders, business magnates, all of them understood the cost of ignoring the mafia's power. And for Luciano, it was validation of his belief that crime, when treated as a business, could not only thrive, but dominate. The mob tax became a defining feature of mid-century America, a shadow economy that operated alongside the legitimate one. While it enriched the mafia, it also highlighted their reach. By the time Luciano was in his final years, he could look back and see the extent of what he had built. An empire where every dollar spent bore his influence, a silent legacy imprinted on the American economy itself.
The public is a bunch of crumbs asking to be taken. And as for doing good, the garment center and the stock market was the heart of New York City. They could not live without each other. If my outfit helped keep the clothing manufacturers going, for which we got a healthy commission, then what, I was just big as a broker as my friend Hutton. So what if I used to muscle some guy because he did not pay up? What does the stockbroker do when his customer cannot meet an overcall? He will just sells the guy out, and then the poor bastard goes to the top of some building and jumps off, which is what happened a couple of years later.
In 1929, the stock market crash unleashed chaos across the financial world, obliterating fortunes and driving some to the brink of despair. For many on Wall Street, the sudden collapse of wealth was too much to bear. Stories circulated of stock traders leaping from the tops of buildings as their hard-earned riches evaporated overnight, a haunting symbol of the era's desperation. Nearly 8 decades later, history would echo this tragedy during the Bernie Madoff scandal. In 2008 and 2009, as Madoff's house of cards crumbled, the financial devastation exposed the fragility of the system once again. Bankers and financiers, overwhelmed by their losses or their complicity, resorted to suicide. One European banker, who had ignored repeated warnings about Madoff's fraud, locked himself in his office and ended his life with a single gunshot, a grim reminder of the stakes in high finance. In the 1920s, amid this economic volatility, Charles Luciano was a world apart from Wall Street's unraveling. At just 28 years old, he was already sitting atop a multi-million-dollar empire, a stark contrast to the ruin surrounding him. His wealth and influence were staggering, especially when measured against the currency value of the era. In those days, fortunes held an almost incomprehensible power. Loyalty, silence, and even lives could be bought for what now seems like a trivial sum. Charlie's ascent was as remarkable as it was ruthless. Born into poverty, he arrived in America as a 9-year-old immigrant with nothing but ambition. By his mid-20s, he had reshaped himself into a criminal mogul, commanding an empire that stretched across gambling, liquor, unions, and more. He had the ear of high society and the respect of the underworld, two realms that rarely acknowledged each other, but were increasingly entwined in his orbit. Despite his growing wealth and influence, Luciano faced an ever-present irritant: law enforcement. Local cops, looking to make a name for themselves, routinely summoned him for questioning. He was dragged into precincts, grilled under hot lights, photographed like a common thug, and subjected to relentless harassment. These encounters weren't just nuisances, they were threats to his reputation, his business, and his carefully curated image. For Charlie, this was a problem that demanded a solution. He couldn't afford to be seen as vulnerable, constantly at the mercy of petty officials seeking to disrupt his operations. Luciano's response was pragmatic. He doubled down on his investments in police protection, using bribes and influence to turn potential enemies into allies. His strategy wasn't just about buying silence. It was about ensuring that the system itself worked in his favor. With the right people on his payroll, he transformed law enforcement from an obstacle into an extension of his enterprise. Luciano's ability to adapt to these challenges showcased the sharp mind that had propelled him from the slums of New York to the pinnacle of the underworld. He understood that wealth wasn't just about material possessions. It was a tool, a weapon, and a shield. By leveraging his fortune and influence, Luciano ensured that even in a world of economic collapse and shifting power, he remained untouchable. For Charlie, survival wasn't just about staying ahead. It was about staying in control. And in 1929, as the world around him crumbled, Charles Luciano proved he had mastered the art of both.
I grew up with that whole system of money buying protection. I used to see it all around me. But by the mid-20s, the payoffs were not just free turkeys at Christmas. This was big stuff.
In the realm of modern corruption, the stakes are measured in trillions, protecting systems so vast they envelop entire nations. Luciano's empire, by comparison, was worth a few $1 million, a staggering fortune in the 1920s, but still a fraction of today's global scale. Yet, even then, Luciano understood the fundamental truth of power. Money alone wasn't enough. To ascend into the major leagues of influence, he needed something more enduring and pervasive, the unwavering support of law enforcement. Luciano's ambition extended far beyond the neighborhood precincts that many mafiosi already controlled. Those precincts were valuable, yes, but their reach was limited to the blocks where gambling dens, speakeasies, and union rackets flourished. Luciano's vision was transformative. He wanted to dominate every precinct in New York City, creating a comprehensive network of protection that would allow him and his men to operate with complete impunity. This wasn't just about avoiding arrests. It was about establishing a shield so impenetrable that the police became an extension of his empire rather than an adversary. To achieve this, Luciano implemented a strategy that was as bold as it was meticulous. Bribes weren't just doled out to the occasional officer or precinct captain. They were systematically spread across the hierarchy. His goal was to have the top brass of every police division in his pocket. This network would provide not only protection, but also a crucial flow of intelligence. Tip-offs about raids, rival activities, or political pressures ensured that Luciano stayed one step ahead of anyone attempting to disrupt his operations. But Luciano's ambitions didn't stop at local law enforcement. As his influence grew and his operations expanded, so too did his reach into more powerful institutions. By the time he and his associates entered their 30s and 40s, they had cultivated connections within the nascent FBI. What began as a loose understanding with certain federal agents soon evolved into a calculated relationship where protection extended beyond city limits. The next phase of Luciano's ascent came in the 1950s, when his empire had expanded to touch nearly every corner of America and beyond. By then, the mafia had become so entrenched that they began collaborating with the CIA. This partnership, born out of mutual necessity, was emblematic of a shifting dynamic in American intelligence. The CIA recognized the mafia's global networks and influence as assets, particularly in operations that required deniability or brute force. In exchange, organized crime gained the ultimate shield: federal protection. Luciano's vision, initially rooted in controlling New York's police force, had grown into a symbiotic relationship with America's most powerful institutions. What had started as bribes to local officers evolved into a far-reaching network of influence that spanned the NYPD, the FBI, and ultimately the CIA. It was a strategy so audacious that it fundamentally altered the mafia's role in American society, embedding it not just in the underworld but in the fabric of legitimate power structures. For Luciano, the ultimate goal was simple but monumental: total security. He didn't want to rely on the loyalty of one or two precincts or the occasional favor from a federal agent. He wanted to ensure that at every level of enforcement, his interests were safeguarded. This ambition wasn't just about survival. It was about creating an empire that could weather any storm, shielded by the very institutions designed to dismantle it. In this, Luciano wasn't just building a criminal syndicate. He was forging a shadow state, one that would influence the course of American history for decades to come.
I did not like the idea of getting smeared all the time. The newspapers would print our pictures. It always seemed to be the same picture. We were surrounded by a bunch of cops when we got hauled in.
Charlie Luciano's rise to power was anything but smooth, as persistent police raids and harassment threatened to undermine his growing empire. These raids, often prompted by ambitious law enforcement officials seeking to boost their profiles or appease the press, became a frustrating and recurring nuisance. For Charlie, this interference was unacceptable. It wasn't just about avoiding jail time. It was about protecting the integrity and efficiency of his operation. Finally fed up, Luciano turned to his trusted lieutenant, Frank Costello, demanding a permanent solution. Charlie's directive was clear. He wanted every police precinct in New York City on the payroll. This was no small task, but Costello, with his polished demeanor and knack for diplomacy, was uniquely suited for the challenge. The rest of the inner circle, Meyer Lansky, Vito Genovese and Joe Adonis, fully supported Charlie's vision. Together, they entrusted Costello to undertake what would become a game-changing strategy in organized crime. Costello approached the task with caution and precision, knowing that this was no mere bribe, but a wholesale transformation of the relationship between organized crime and law enforcement. Through a series of backroom negotiations and discreet meetings, he began to align the police hierarchy with Luciano's interests. At the heart of the plan was a payment scheme designed to secure loyalty from the top down. By late 1925, the money began flowing into the pockets of key officials, including police commissioners like Joseph A. Warren and Grover A. Whalen. The numbers were staggering. Initially, the mafia paid $10,000 per week, an extraordinary amount in the 1920s. Over time, as their influence deepened, this sum doubled to $20,000 a week. In an era where police salaries were modest, such payments effectively bought unwavering loyalty. Precincts became unofficial extensions of Luciano's organization, their officers functioning more like mafia associates than public servants. The corruption ran deeper than mere bribery. Luciano's associates began placing made members and trusted affiliates within the police force itself, ensuring a direct line of influence. This infiltration allowed the mafia to monitor investigations, suppress evidence, and control the outcomes of critical cases. Officers who dared to resist or expose the corruption faced brutal consequences. The film Serpico, starring Al Pacino, famously depicted the dangers faced by honest cops trying to fight corruption in the 1960s. What Serpico didn't show was that this culture of corruption had roots extending back to the 1920s, nurtured by men like Luciano and Costello. By the time Luciano's plan reached full maturity, the mafia wasn't just evading the law, they were bending it to their will. Police stations became safe havens, and law enforcement operated as a shield for organized crime. This integration of the mafia with law enforcement set the stage for a new era of criminal enterprise, where the lines between the legitimate and the illicit blurred beyond recognition. During one of their high-level meetings, Charlie, with a mix of pride and pragmatism, reportedly remarked, "It's not about the money, it's about the control. Money buys silence, but control makes sure nobody even whispers." It was a sentiment that captured the essence of Luciano's strategy. The mafia wasn't just paying for protection. They were embedding themselves into the very infrastructure of power. This bold strategy marked the beginning of a new chapter in organized crime. Luciano and Costello didn't just secure protection, They pioneered a model of influence that would extend into politics, unions, and federal agencies. It was a system so entrenched that it persisted for decades, with far-reaching consequences for both law enforcement and society. What began as a response to police harassment became one of the most defining and enduring aspects of the mafia's power.
Look, what good is it if we buy some precinct or 10 precincts? I do not want 1 or 10 precincts. I want all the precincts. Frank, you are the best fixer in the whole fucking country. You do not realize that these big shots are the same guys we got in our pockets already. They are in our speaks every night, drinking our best alcohol. It is just a matter of handling, and how much.
Frank Costello turned to Charlie Luciano with a look of disbelief, his voice laced with doubt. Charlie, you're asking the impossible. You're talking about buying the real big shots. But Charlie, unfazed, met Frank's skepticism with quiet confidence. He had no doubts about Costello's abilities. If anyone could accomplish such an audacious feat, it was Frank, the polished diplomat of the underworld. With calculated caution and a meticulous approach, Costello set to work. The plan he devised wasn't just bold, it was revolutionary. Through a series of discreet negotiations and carefully placed bribes, he began laying the groundwork to align the highest levels of law enforcement, starting with the office of the police commissioner, under Luciano's growing empire. By late 1925, the payments began to flow, marking a seismic shift in the power dynamics of organized crime. The sums were staggering, even by today's standards. Police, commissioners, precinct captains, and officers at every level were drawn into Luciano's orbit. This was more than just protection. It was influence on a scale that had never been seen before. With this newfound leverage, Luciano and his men could purchase anything or anyone, anywhere, at any time. Politicians, mayors, judges, and even law enforcement officials all became part of the mafia's sprawling web of control. Luciano's personal charm and charisma were pivotal to this operation. Despite his streetwise English and gruff exterior, Charlie had a magnetic personality and a knack for captivating people with his storytelling. His celebrity status grew alongside his power, with newspapers frequently chronicling his exploits. In a city that seemed to thrive on myth and legend, Charlie Luciano was becoming one of its central figures. He wasn't just feared, he was admired. Even the man responsible for constructing the Empire State Building personally shook Luciano's hand in recognition of his growing influence. Yet, this wasn't just about Charlie. Behind his towering presence was a well-oiled machine of capable and intelligent lieutenants. Frank Costello had his own formidable crew, and Vito Genovese operated with precision and ruthlessness alongside his own men. Meyer Lansky, always the strategist, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, with his army of enforcers, extended their operations far beyond New York. Together, these factions, along with countless unnamed soldiers and associates, formed the backbone of an empire that spanned the United States. This wasn't merely the work of a few infamous figures. It was the effort of hundreds of men, each playing a vital role. Some wielded power in the spotlight, others toiled in the shadows, ensuring that the gears of organized crime turned smoothly. Every bribe, every handshake, every deal contributed to Luciano's ultimate vision, an organization so vast, so entrenched, that it controlled the very fabric of society. Reflecting on 1925 in his later years, Luciano often described it as the turning point, not just for himself, but for the entire history of organized crime. It was the year he transcended the role of a street boss and became something far greater, the de facto ruler of New York's underworld. In his words, "That's when I bought myself a state." This era cemented Luciano's legacy as the architect of modern organized crime. The alliances he forged, the influence he wielded, and the control he purchased created a model that would endure for decades, shaping not only the mafia, but also the very institutions it infiltrated. It was the moment when crime stopped being just a street-level operation and became a shadow empire, with Luciano at its helm.
When I think about that meeting, it was really the turning point of our move to the top. None of the guys who was with me was cheap, and every one of them could add. We started with nothing, and we got up into 7 figures. What difference would it make if it cost us $1 million? We knew it would bring in more than that.
In the mid-1920s, Charlie Luciano and his contemporaries wielded power with a precision that mirrored the tactics of today's corporate giants. Just as major corporations now funnel vast sums into political campaigns and lobbying efforts to secure influence and protect their interests, Luciano's empire leveraged money and connections to dominate their world. The parallels are striking. Both systems thrive on the ability to purchase loyalty, ensure protection, and shape the landscape to their advantage. Luciano's method was straightforward yet revolutionary. He used his wealth to buy not just safety, but respect, an intangible yet invaluable commodity. With carefully placed bribes and strategic alliances, he ensured that his interest remained untouched and his operations undisturbed. Police precincts, political offices, and even courtrooms fell under his sphere of influence. He didn't just play the game, he rewrote the rules. The power Luciano amassed wasn't just defensive. It was also a tool for expansion. Like a modern corporation diversifying its portfolio, Luciano used his influence to establish new ventures. Gambling dens, bootlegging routes, and unions all fell under his control, each venture reinforcing his hold on the city's economy. Where corporations today secure legislation to favor their industries, Luciano secured enforcement, or lack thereof, to ensure his ventures thrived. What made Luciano exceptional was his understanding that power wasn't static. To maintain his dominance, he constantly reinvested in relationships, fostering loyalty from those who mattered most. His network extended far beyond the underworld. High society, law enforcement, and political circles all played a part in his empire's success. He understood that power wasn't just about money, it was about perception. If people respected him, even grudgingly, they would think twice before challenging him. In many ways, Luciano's approach to power mirrors the dynamics of modern America. Corporations use their financial clout to shape policy, just as Luciano used his criminal fortune to shape New York. Both systems reveal an uncomfortable truth. When money and influence intertwine, those who control them can rewrite the rules to serve their own interests. Whether it's in the boardroom or the back room, the game remains the same. Only the players change.
I remember Joe Adonis standing across the room looking in the mirror and combing his hair like he always did. It was his way of stalling. Everybody else, Anastasia, Scalise, Moretti, Dutch Schultz, who came to the meet even though he had the flu and his doc told him to stay in bed. He sat over in a corner so he would not spread his germs around. They all said yes. We all sat there looking at Joe's back while he kept running the comb through his hair like a movie actor. Finally, he turned around with a big smile and said, "The star says yes," referring to himself, of course. Dutch ran across the room and grabbed Joe's head in a hammerlock and breathed right in his face, saying, "Now you are a fucking star, you have my germs." Joe actually did catch Dutch's flu, and for a solid week, he was calling me up on the phone from bed with a voice like a hoarse frog, telling me to warn the Dutchman to stay out of his way.
The critical task of delivering bribes to the NYPD fell to Joe Cooney, a loyal underling in Luciano's organization. Cooney, also known by the unfortunate nickname Joe the Coon, loathed the moniker, which carried overt racial connotations. His resentment stemmed from his own racist leanings, yet he swallowed his pride to serve Luciano. Cooney's Irish heritage, marked by his red hair and freckled face, made him an ideal candidate for the role. His unassuming appearance allowed him to move unnoticed through the city, a vital quality for someone entrusted with such a delicate mission. Luciano personally outlined the importance of the assignment to Cooney, emphasizing the need for absolute discretion. Cooney, initially overwhelmed by the gravity of the task, was uncertain where to begin. Following Luciano's careful instructions, he carried the money in a plain brown bag, deliberately nondescript to appear as though it contained nothing more than a laborer's lunch. Cooney dressed the part too, donning workman's attire that suggested he was just another contractor bustling around the city. Every week, like clockwork, Cooney would make his way to police headquarters at noon. Upon arrival, he would hand over the cash-stuffed bag under the guise of performing maintenance work, occasionally changing a light bulb to complete the illusion. In doing so, Luciano established what would later become a quintessential mob role, the bagman. Cooney's routine became a cornerstone of Luciano's strategy, greasing the wheels of law enforcement and ensuring a steady flow of information, warnings, and, if necessary, damage control. With this arrangement in place, police officials began reaching out to Luciano personally, providing tips about potential threats and working collaboratively to manage any trouble. Of course, occasional hiccups arose in the form of minor harassment from rogue lawmen or vindictive politicians. Luciano brushed these off with characteristic humor, famously remarking, "Some politicians couldn't screw their wives, so they tried having a good time screwing me and my guys." Even when inconvenienced by minor offenses, such as parking tickets, Luciano paid the fines promptly, a gesture he found amusingly ironic given his broader defiance of the law. While New York hummed smoothly under Luciano's well-oiled machine, Chicago was a different story entirely. Johnny Torrio, nicknamed the Fox for his cunning, was grappling with an escalating gang war. Torrio, who held seniority over Luciano by 15 years, had built a formidable empire in Chicago. Yet his efforts to broker peace in the volatile underworld fell apart following the murder of Big Jim Colosimo. Torrio had enlisted Frankie Yale to eliminate Colosimo, setting off a chain reaction of bloodshed that culminated in the murder of rival gang leader Dion O'Banion. The retaliation for O'Banion's death was swift and brutal. Torrio narrowly survived an assassination attempt, reportedly orchestrated by O'Banion's allies, including George Bugs Moran and Jaime Weiss. The story seemed straightforward, yet Luciano, always the skeptic, viewed it differently. To him, Torrio's near-fatal encounter wasn't merely the result of a revenge plot, it was the price of ambition. Luciano believed Torrio's mistake stemmed from overconfidence, a belief that peace could be brokered in a city defined by chaos. For all his cunning, Torrio underestimated the ferocity of Chicago's gangland politics. Charlie saw in Torrio's struggle a cautionary tale. Power, unchecked, could be as dangerous as any rival. It reinforced Luciano's commitment to strategy and patience, ensuring his empire was built on alliances and influence, rather than brute force alone. Chicago's turmoil contrasted sharply with the relative order Luciano maintained in New York. While Torrio's empire teetered on the edge of collapse, Luciano's was solidifying into an unshakable foundation. And yet, Charlie knew that even the most carefully constructed systems could falter if ambition outpaced caution, a lesson he would carry with him as his empire expanded into uncharted territory.
But I know that Al was behind the try on Torrio. Even though he always said he did not have nothing to do with it, he tried to eliminate Johnny the same way Johnny done with Colosimo.
Johnny Torrio's recovery from the attempt on his life was nothing short of miraculous, but it marked a turning point in his criminal career. After serving a 9-month sentence in an Illinois prison, Torrio decided it was time to step back from the spotlight. From behind bars, he handed the reins of his empire to Al Capone, a move that would forever change the landscape of organized crime in Chicago. Capone rose to power like a force of nature, transforming Torrio's foundation into one of the most formidable criminal syndicates in history. Under Capone's leadership, men like Paul Ricca, Tony Accardo, and Sam Giancana came into their own, forming the backbone of what would become a near unshakable empire. Capone's brilliance wasn't just in expanding the operation, but in fostering a network of loyal and capable lieutenants who carried his vision forward. When Torrio walked out of the prison gates, Capone ensured his mentor's safety with a 3-car motorcade, escorting him directly to the train station for his trip east. It was a gesture of gratitude and respect, Capone's way of honoring the man who had taught him the art of the underworld. But before Torrio disappeared into the shadows, he made one final move that would leave an indelible mark on the future of organized crime. He picked up the phone and called Charlie Luciano in New York. Torrio's message to Luciano was one of urgency and foresight. He arranged a meeting, determined to share a crucial piece of advice with his young protégé. When they sat down, Johnny warned Charlie of an impending shift that would shake the foundations of their business, the eventual repeal of the Volstead Act. The law that had fueled their rise, the prohibition of alcohol, would not last forever. Torrio, always the strategist, urged Luciano to plan ahead. "Charlie," he reportedly said, "you need to look past the liquor. The money's good now, but it won't last. Find the next thing: gambling, unions, drugs. Diversify. Make sure you're ready when the law changes." This warning resonated deeply with Luciano. Torrio had built his empire on intelligence and adaptability, and Charlie knew better than to ignore his advice. The meeting cemented the bond between two of the greatest criminal minds of their era, marking a passing of the torch in a way. Luciano left the meeting not just with a plan, but with a vision of the future. One that would see the mafia expand its reach far beyond bootlegging, into industries and rackets that would sustain their power for decades to come. As Torrio faded into the background, his influence lingered, woven into the fabric of the underworld he'd helped shape. Luciano, taking Torrio's warning to heart, would go on to execute a strategy that ensured his empire's survival long after Prohibition ended, cementing his place in the annals of organized crime history.
Johnny was a guy who could see around corners, just like Meyer Lansky. One time I even told him that the barrel of his gun was curved, and he laughed at that, but he did not deny it. When we met, he told me he was going to take a vacation in Italy. He'd gotten his naturalization papers, so he didn't have nothing to worry about, and he had millions stashed away. He told me he wanted to talk over a plan. He thought alcohol was going to become legal again, and he wanted to become my agent in Europe, to start buying up legal options on the best scotch to get ready for the end of the Volstead Act. This was 7 long years before repeal, and it was almost impossible to believe. Here was a guy predicting that my whole fucking illegal business, and everybody else's for that matter, was going to wind up in the shithouse.
The next day, Luciano convened his trusted circle: Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, Johnny Torrio, and others. As he revealed Torrio's warning about the potential repeal of the Volstead Act, the room fell silent. While most were blindsided, Meyer Lansky wasn't. Ever the strategist, Lansky leaned forward, his mind already at work. "Charlie," he said, "to secure our future, we need more than rackets. The path forward is legitimacy, aligning with businesses and politicians who can protect us." Johnny Torrio expanded on Lansky's vision. He urged Luciano to move beyond local elections, advocating for influence on a larger scale: primaries, general elections, even legislation. Torrio envisioned Luciano not just as a boss, but as a kingmaker. Shortly after, Torrio left for a brief stay in Italy, only to cut his trip short as Mussolini's regime began its ruthless crackdown on the mafia. Back in New York, he rejoined Luciano's growing empire. Acting on Torrio's advice, Luciano mobilized his men. Costello, Lansky, and their associates began infiltrating high-level politics, systematically influencing elections and dominating labor unions. By controlling unions, the mafia commanded the loyalty of millions, transforming their influence into an electoral powerhouse. workers became a voting bloc that no politician could ignore. By the 1930s, the mafia had forged alliances with major corporations and influential elites. Politicians seeking victory often found themselves courting Luciano's organization, recognizing their unparalleled ability to sway public opinion and deliver votes. The New York outfit became the operation's epicenter, extending its reach into Washington, D.C. and beyond. Their tactics were both subtle and overt, buying politicians, tying them to lucrative contracts, and intimidating opponents. Luciano's organization targeted figures like Tammany Hall's Jimmy Hines and Albert Marinelli, securing their grip on New York's political and judicial systems. By the mid-1930s, political manipulation had become second nature. Luciano, Lansky, Costello, and Torrio blurred the lines between organized crime and political power, crafting a system that safeguarded their rackets and ensured their empire thrived. This wasn't just organized crime. It was organized dominance.
I made it a policy from the beginning that we should not just link up with Tammany Hall and the Democrats. To me, that would look like we were taking sides, and the truth of it was, I could not care less. We went with the Republicans too. In my book, it was a three-party system, them two and us.
The mafia's strategy during the 20s and 30s mirrors the dynamics of modern-day political donors, whose influence transcends party lines. Just as corporate titans and billionaires today pour money into both Republican and Democratic campaigns, ensuring that no matter who holds office, their interests remain protected, Luciano and his associates wielded their influence across the entire political spectrum. Their objective was clear: policy over ideology. It wasn't about left or right, liberal or conservative. It was about safeguarding their enterprises, unions, gambling operations, and rackets from government interference. The mafia's approach was brutally effective. As long as politicians ensured their ventures remained untouched, the mafia reciprocated with protection, financial backing, and muscle where necessary. In this arrangement, loyalty became a two-way street, with the underworld and the political elite becoming deeply entangled. Over time, this symbiotic relationship grew, with the mafia constructing a shadow empire that extended into the highest levels of government. By the 1930s, the mafia had penetrated the halls of power in ways unimaginable a decade earlier. This wasn't just about bribes to local precinct captains or aldermen anymore. It was about influence that reached all the way to Washington, D.C. Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration benefited from their support during his rise, and subsequent administrations, including those of Dwight D. Eisenhower and Richard Nixon, would also find themselves indebted to, or at least influenced by, organized crime. Perhaps most famously, the Kennedy family became entangled in the mafia's web. Joe Kennedy's ambitions and connections to bootlegging during Prohibition forged relationships with figures like Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky. Decades later, during John F. Kennedy's presidency, these relationships would come back to haunt the family as tensions between the mafia and the administration reached a boiling point. But in the 20s and 30s, such conflicts were still on the horizon. At that time, the mafia's focus was on building its political empire, one local election at a time. Charlie Luciano, ever the strategist, recognized the importance of playing the long game. He understood that to secure his empire's future, he needed to cultivate political alliances that would endure beyond individual terms of office. He didn't just back candidates, he identified winners. Luciano's knack for spotting political talent and aligning it with his vision made him a formidable player in the political arena. By methodically expanding their influence in local elections, Luciano and his associates created a system where politicians sought them out, not the other way around. Despite setbacks like the Appalachian debacle in 1957, which exposed the mafia's sprawling network to law enforcement, and the loss of their lucrative operations in Cuba following Castro's rise to power, the mafia's influence only grew. By the mid-20s and 30s, they had become a force to be reckoned with, organizing elections, dictating policy, and shaping the political landscape in their favor. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to see the bigger picture. He wasn't content with being a king of the underworld. He wanted to be a kingmaker in the legitimate world as well. This duality allowed him to straddle two worlds, exerting influence not just on the streets of New York, but also in the corridors of power. As politicians came to rely on Luciano and his organization for support, it became clear that the mafia wasn't just a criminal enterprise. It was a shadow government, wielding power that rivaled even the state itself.
We wanted good guys, winners. Even though we played both sides of the political line and that way we could not lose, still it was a good thing to have a guy elected who could do a nice job and get re-elected easier. That way, the second time, the campaign did not cost so much. It got so I could pick political winners better than I could pick horses.
Every night, before drifting off to sleep, Charlie Luciano had a ritual. He would settle into bed with the day's newspapers, the Daily News and the Mirror. While the New York Times eluded him due to its more complex language, these tabloids provided him with all the information he needed to stay informed. As he flipped through the pages, reading about assembly members, council members, congressmen and senators, a striking realization would often wash over him. Many of these powerful figures were in their positions because of him. Charlie would linger on stories about what these men were doing in Washington, debating policies, passing laws, wielding influence. It was a sobering and thrilling thought. These weren't just faceless politicians shaping the nation. They were individuals he had helped elevate. They owed their careers, at least in part, to the quiet but potent backing of Luciano's empire. Through his alliances with men like Frank Costello, Meyer Pasha Lansky, and Johnny Torrio, Charlie had mastered the art of political manipulation. These weren't just favors or bribes, they were investments. Each candidate backed by Luciano represented a strategic move, ensuring that his interests were safeguarded and his operations remained untouchable. It wasn't just about power for power's sake. It was about control, influence, and foresight. As Charlie read about their decisions, he couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of triumph. He had come to America as a penniless immigrant, mocked for his broken English, hustling on the streets of New York to survive. Now he wasn't just running the city's underworld. He was shaping its political future. Senators, congressmen, and assembly members, people the public viewed as the nation's leaders, were in some way indebted to him. It was an extraordinary evolution. Luciano had transformed from a street kid scraping by in the 5 Points to a man who not only read about power in the papers, but also orchestrated it behind the scenes. To the world, these politicians were symbols of democracy and progress. To Charlie, they were reminders of his unparalleled reach, a testament to his ability to influence not just the underworld, but the very fabric of the nation. For Luciano, this nightly ritual wasn't just about staying informed, it was about reflection. The headlines reminded him of the empire he had built and the indelible mark he was leaving on the world. As he closed his eyes each night, he wasn't just a mob boss. In his mind, he was a kingmaker, with the nation's future resting, in part, on the alliances he had forged and the power he had so carefully cultivated.
I would lay there and read that stuff, and it all looked so legit I could not believe I'd done it, that it was my muscle that put them very respectable guys where they were. Talk about muscle, there's muscle and muscle. There were people on the streets with muscle, and to make things go the way I wanted, and I had them. Then there was the other kind of muscle, to get the laws passed the right way, to get things done smooth and legal. I personally helped elect more than 80 guys over a short time, all voting my way, aldermen, councilmen, mayors, congressmen, even senators. They were mine. I picked them. I elected them. They belonged to me, lock, stock, and barrel.
And so, we conclude part 1 of our narrative, chronicling the extraordinary ascent of Charles Lucky Luciano. a man who transformed the landscape of organized crime and left an indelible mark on history. From his humble beginnings as an immigrant boy with limited command of the English language, Luciano's journey has been one of relentless ambition, strategic genius, and ruthless pragmatism. We've explored the pivotal moments that defined his rise, his early alliances with visionaries like Meyer Lansky, Vito Genovese, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello. We witnessed the network of power he constructed alongside men like Willie Moretti, Longy Zwillman, and Johnny the Fox Torrio. By the mid-1920s, Luciano had achieved what many deemed impossible, securing control over New York City's local elections, precincts, and political machinery. Mayors, judges, law enforcement officials, and even members of the social elite found themselves entangled in his ever-expanding web of influence. In his late 20s, Luciano's accomplishments were unparalleled. He had effectively conquered New York, with only a handful of rivals daring to stand against him. The rest either capitulated or aligned themselves with his burgeoning empire. Esteemed figures in organized crime, such as Arnold Rothstein, had lent their mentorship and resources to his rise, while Johnny Torrio's sage advice and Al Capone's growing empire in Chicago fortified his national standing. Even beyond New York, Luciano was laying the groundwork for an empire that spanned states. Mo Dalitz reached out from the Midwest, solidifying connections that extended Luciano's reach into Cleveland. Meanwhile, Luciano's early overtures to the Trafficante family in Florida hinted at the beginnings of a southern expansion that would later see him and Carlo Gambino forging alliances in Louisiana by the 1930s. By the close of the decade, Luciano's influence wasn't merely localized, it was systemic. He had mastered the art of manipulating elections, bending politicians to his will, and ensuring the loyalty of law enforcement and judges alike. The very Volstead Act, intended to create a more orderly and virtuous America, had instead birthed a criminal juggernaut. Under Luciano's leadership, this juggernaut became one of the most powerful and influential criminal organizations the world had ever seen. As we end this chapter, one thing is certain: Luciano's story is far from over. He stands on the precipice of even greater power, with his sights set on unifying the disparate factions of organized crime into a cohesive syndicate. But with every rise comes new challenges, enemies, and opportunities, setting the stage for the next chapter in the saga of Charles Luciano, the architect of the modern mafia.